And so now for our song and prayer, we'll have Ringing Shield Drum Group.
Oh, matakapi. Humpumpumielo. Dayawa chiankapelo. I said, hello, my relatives. They call me Broken Leg. Feels good to see all of you here. My American name is Thorn LaPointe. That is what I'm known by in the American Indian community. But my relatives back home know me as Broken Leg. When I introduced myself, I called you my relatives, because that is a spiritual foundation we must come here today on, is a sense of relatedness. You see, my grandfather used to say that we can have a community, but if there's no relatedness, there is no community. You cannot expect to have a community without a sense of relatedness. How that spirituality looks like in lived form, in a lived reality and experience for our people, is the making of relatives. So as indigenous peoples, we got to remember who we are. We got to remember our cultures. We have to remember where education and learning starts first, particularly for our young ones, and that is the Tioshpai, the family. For us, the family is a primary source of expertise, of learning and prosperity. When we come together, we remember our families, those who prayed for us, those who came before us, our ancestors. So Woplatranka, the drum group you see here is Wahachankachla, ringing show. That is the name of the spirit of that drum. That is also the name of our great-great-grandfather, who was a medicine man, Shichanghu from Rosebud, South Dakota. So with that, my relatives, we're going to open up in a good way, in the best way we know how, with prayer.
The first song we sang talked about this Lakota man that when he passed away, his relatives could hear him singing outside the village. And in that song, he was talking about how much he loved his people and his Lakota way of life. And the second song we sang honored the children, that in these hard times, our mothers and fathers help us to have guidance and the wisdom we need to make it through. So we want to follow this with the prayer song, Wopila, for this morning and for this day that you all will be having. And then we'll follow in a prayer in the Lakota language.
Shema Keayoy, Haye Ma Keayoy, Shema Keayoy, Haye Dako He Hakoi, Hiye Cheto Teloy, Haye Ma Keayoy, Yani Peteloy, Haye Ao te Kashla wa Kantank Unchi, Wopla Tanka Chichapi, Unkeapi, Wana na Tokadaki Owaste, Unkaha Binkte, Naha, Oyate Trechana wa Kaija, Chankoluta Kilianka, Woksape, Umani Pikte Okiapo, Triwahe, Unki Troapi, with Chozana with Choni, Kup O, Naha, Changlesko Waka, Unhe Angela Pikte, Na Tokadaki Owaste Daya, Mauni Pikte Unkiapo. How, Metaki Yase. Oh, Daki Yase. Thank you.
Ampedu de, ampedu washte, chande washte atimaheo. In the language of my Lakota relatives, today is a good day, and come in with a good heart. And I hope we bring good thoughts and good thinking and good strategizing and good spirits with us as we celebrate higher education in Indian communities, and to bring our best practices and best ideas forward so we can help and expand all of Indian country. I am Patrice Kunish. I am the director of the Center for Indian Country Development. Welcome all of you on behalf of Dick Todd and the whole CICD team to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank and to our conference on higher education, aptly entitled Tribal Perspectives on Higher Education, for the discussion we hope to elicit today. And a sincere wopila and thanks and gratitude to our drum group, Ringing Shield, Wakinan and Thorn LaPointe for sharing their drum and songs and for starting us and starting this gathering in a good way. We'll see them again tomorrow evening. I am very pleased to see all of you here today for this really important dialogue about tribal communities and the higher education system. And to those joining us on live stream, thanks for your time and attention to this conversation, and we hope to hear from you too. I think that we can all appreciate in today's world that access to education and research provided by colleges and universities is absolutely critical to the prosperity and well-being of our communities. And this is particularly salient to tribal communities because despite some really good progress, higher education system is not yet meeting the needs of either the community or the individual. American Indians and Alaskan Natives remain well below the national average in completion of college degrees, and as a result, their access to good jobs and lifetime earnings in today's knowledge economy is significantly limited. In a similar vein, tribal governments often wrestle with complex policy decisions without the array of necessary data, as well as academic research and support available to many state and local governments. And many of you in this room today have worked really hard to address these issues, and I really commend you for that contribution. We have representatives from tribal colleges whose growth in recent decades has made college education more affordable and accessible in many Native communities. Similarly, we have many community colleges represented here, and they strive to make college more accessible to American Indians and Alaskan Natives from a wide range of reservation and non-reservation communities, including our really important urban Indian communities. Our program and audience today also include representatives from some of the traditional public and private universities that are working to make their vitally important educational and research services more readily available to Native communities as well. And finally, we have representatives here from a number of government agencies, the state legislature, nonprofits, and philanthropic organizations whose missions include promoting better access to higher education services in tribal communities. And we certainly plan to take full advantage of all of your expertise and experience in this area. Our conference is organized around 3 half-days. You've probably all taken a look at our agenda, beginning with this afternoon's focus on data issues, and then continuing tomorrow with sessions first on student educational experience, and then on research and technical assistance. To get us started, we have each half-day session beginning with presentations by respected scholars and leaders that will that will provide us with a shared base understanding. We then will close with a moderated discussion in which all of you will have an opportunity to participate. We're also going to try to bring in questions from the online audience watching this event live stream. So as you listen to each of these sessions' presentation, please write down your questions and save them for this dialogue. So to help us get ready, let me preview the 3 sessions in a bit more detail. This afternoon, as I said, we will look at what the currently available data say about tribal communities' higher educational outcomes, and then ask about additional data and what we need to better guide decision makers. I hope we can come away with some post-conference initiatives to provide better data strategies. Tomorrow morning, we will review some of the most salient successes and gaps and opportunities for improving how the higher education system serves students from the Native communities. We have really some terrific presentations planned, but we're going to look to all of you for ideas on how to create more success stories throughout Indian country. And then finally, tomorrow afternoon, we will look at the best opportunities for improvement and how the higher education system serves tribal communities through outreach, research, and technical assistance. We'll hear about key Indian country issues regarding the allocation of resources in land-grant and public university sectors, and look again at solutions and strategies for follow-up action. So as you can see, we have some really big ideas on the agenda for all of us to consider and to talk about. And do keep in mind the theme of the conference, our conference goal, which is to develop strategies for tribal communities to gain the full benefit of colleges and university education and research assistance. So I look forward to seeing what we can do together toward this end. So, and right before we begin, I think I should go over some logistics for your comfort and convenience. The restrooms and drinking fountains are beyond the back door and in the hallway. Many of you are going to be planning to use your online devices during the conference, so we have provided information, and if you need any more assistance, please contact one of the CICD or bank staff. As I mentioned earlier, we are live streaming and taping the event. We plan to post the videos and the slide decks on our website after the conference. So while you might want to take copious notes, as educators you are, please sit back and really enjoy and listen to the presentations. If you tweet, we are at Fed Indian Center, and we're using the hashtag for this conference, Native Higher Ed. We'll have a break at 3:30 with beverages and light snacks, and at the end of the day, we'll continue the conversation in the lobby with the reception. And we're happy to help you plan your dinner events too. Tomorrow morning is very important, and I hope that you'll be joining us for breakfast at 7:30, and then opening remarks by the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank President, Neel Kashkari, at 8:15. President Kashkari is very committed to improving access to high-quality education and to finding fundamental long-term solutions to inequality. So please plan to come early so that you can get through security and then hear his remarks. Well, it's time to get started, and we're so excited to have all of you here today and to learn from our conversations. Our first speaker is Dr. Christine Stoddard, professor of agricultural economics and economics at Montana State University. For information on Professor Stoddard and our other conference presenters, please refer to the speaker bios in your folders. I also would like to give special thanks to Chris for her assistance with planning this conference, along with my colleague Dick Todd, who's poured himself into this conference, and to other members of our informal planning committee, Brian Brayboy, Jeannie Sims-Hip, Chris Meyer, and David Saunders. We could not have organized this event without your help. So without further ado, we'll have Chris come up.
Yep, that's great. Okay, let's see if this works here. All right, so I'm an economist by training, and so this talk is mostly an overview of a bunch of numbers. Most of my research focuses on education policy, and currently I'm doing a lot of work related to student loans and how students finance their education. So pieces of that will be included towards the end. So I have way more material in these slides than we have time to cover it. I'm hoping that the slides can be used as a resource for you. So some of this I'll go through sort of quickly. Many of these facts may be familiar to you. I'm hoping that others are a little bit new. And they come from a variety of data sources. And you'll notice after each of these data sources here, I have a caveat. So the Common Core of data doesn't always include information about Bureau of Indian Education schools. The IPEDS data about colleges, the data from two-year institutions and smaller institutions is often not really that great, especially when we look at completions. And the National Post-Secondary Student AIDS Survey only has about 1,000 Native students in the latest wave. It's not representative at the state or the community level. As I've been digging into some of this, these data sources don't always agree. So, folks, take it all with a grain of salt, right? As we go through here. And one thing I'm particularly interested in is hearing your comments about places where what we see in the data may or may not match your experience or the experience of your institution, so we can think about what other ways of measuring and collecting data might be helpful to capture the experience of Native students and the institutions that serve them. So I've organized this presentation around three kind of basic questions, just to sort of get the lay of the land. So the first question just looks at overall levels of college attainment for Native students. How have those changed over time? How do those compare to other groups who might face similar levels of disadvantage along different dimensions? What do the characteristics of Native students who are enrolled in higher education look like? What kinds of institutions do they attend? How is that changing? How do they fund their education? And then hopefully we'll be able to spend more time on this last point, which is what factors seem to promote access to higher education for Native students. And there, again, I'm going to draw on my research that also looks at other kinds of populations of students who might be first-generation college goers or students from low-income groups, and what has the research found that might be helpful in terms of promoting access for those groups. All right, so first of all, what do overall levels of college attainment look like? So as I'll show a little later, many Native students begin attending college at slightly older ages than than other students nationally. And so if we look at students, by the time the population has turned 25 to 35 years old, most students by then have completed their education. About half of Native students have some college training. And we'll talk more about bachelor's versus other kinds of degrees in a little bit. If we're just looking at high school graduates, it's close to 60% who have some college training. And the good news is that percentage has risen over the past several decades, but one concern is that the rate for Native students has not increased quite as quickly as some other groups. And even more concerning, I think if we look at trends in high school graduation, so we're kind of looking at that flow coming in, there's maybe even more cause for concern. So I'll leave that for your reference if you want to look at it later, but here are some of the graphs. So this is looking at only US-born citizens, so we kind of abstract from the issue of foreign students in our universities or immigrant students. Whoops, wrong button. There we go. So my first bar here looks at all Native individuals who are ages 25 to 35 in the American Community Survey, so young adults. And of those, this bottom blue bar shows what percentage lack a high school degree. And you can see that that percentage is kind of similar when we look across Native students or Hispanic students or Black students. The next bar shows how many have a high school degree. And then the next one looks at individuals who have some college but don't have a bachelor's degree. So one of the things that you'll see in this graph, and we'll see as we move throughout, is that relative to other groups, Native students are much more likely to get some college, but not necessarily a bachelor's degree. So this is looking at kind of that same picture, but now just restricting it to high school graduates. So you graduate, yes?
American Indian or Alaskan Native specifically, or that identify as two or more races?
This is one that just looks at American Indians specifically. So I have pulled all of those numbers if you identify as two or more races. And in general, the numbers look a little bit better. So if we look at students who indicate some Native ancestry, they tend to be slightly higher in terms of graduation rates and slightly higher in terms of bachelor's degree rates. So if you're interested, I'd be happy. I made all the slides with that in it at one point, and then I took them out because I thought, oh, this is too many numbers. But I'd be happy to provide that to you.
Perfect. I'm glad to hear that, because that's one of the issues that we deal with on college campuses is there's a lot of students who view that as enrolled band member of a tribe that's federally recognized versus actual, I'm a descendant or I self-identify. So.
Yes. No, that's an excellent point. One of the things that we've seen in the data, not to go off in this direction too far, is that for Hispanic students, there's also a real growth in the number of Hispanic students who identify with some indigenous ancestry. And so it becomes really blurry when we're thinking about, enrolled tribes in the United States versus indigenous ancestry in some other part of Latin America. So, yeah, great question. So this is looking at that same number, kind of tracking this over time. Whoops. Sorry, I have two green buttons here. I keep doing the wrong one. So along with my SALT here, of course, Native populations are small. And so the numbers tend to bounce around quite a bit when we look at the percentage of now 18 to 24-year-olds who are enrolled in some degree granting institution. This kind of smaller green line is my noisy annual measure, and so I smoothed that out with a moving average for this one here, and you can see this shows an increase in the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds who are enrolled in college, and so that's a success. That's a good thing. Since 2000, that rate has gone up, but we can see, particularly when we compare it to Hispanic students, they looked a lot like Native students until about 2010, and then the rates have diverged a little bit. So it seems like there's more room for improvement. And I would suggest there's also maybe some future concern about what this is going to look like moving forward when we look at high school dropout trends, because even though high school graduation rates have risen since 2000, they've kind of plateaued really in the last 10 years. So here you can see, here's the overall U.S. high school graduation rate. So this is looking at incoming freshmen and 4 years later, what percentage of them have graduated, and that's about 82%. And for Native students, that's about 70%. And you can see this kind of plateau here. And again, if we contrast that with other groups, the rates of high school graduation were higher relative to other disadvantaged groups earlier in this period, but have kind of plateaued. And so certainly that's beyond the scope of this conference, but something that's worth thinking about as we think about the types of students that are coming into higher education and what their experiences have been. And that's just similar, looking at dropout rate status and showing that, again, that rate has really plateaued in recent years. Okay, so that gives us a sense of what overall levels are. Yes?
It excludes BIE schools?
That's correct.
Does all of your data exclude BIE?
All of the CCD data does. So.
Only the slides it's noted?
Yep, only the slide that it's noted. Yep. Which is, again, why I have my SALT up here. Yeah. All right, so let's look a little bit at how Native students differ from other groups. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about their demographic characteristics, but mostly what I'd like to focus on is the kinds of institutions that Native students attend and how that may have changed in recent years. And some of that I'm sure you're familiar with, but there were other factors that were surprising to me at least. And then I'd also like to talk a little bit about how students fund their education. Whoops, sorry, I went backwards. Okay. So this is now looking at this National Post-Secondary Aid Study. So the latest wave of that was in 2012. So things may be different today than they were then, but it gives us, it's at least the most recent snapshot of what demographics of students look like across a whole variety of dimensions. And again, there were 1,000 students who self-identified as primarily American Indian or Alaska Native in these data. So, a couple of points of interest. So first, Native students tend to be older when they start college. That's similar to Black students, but a little bit older than for Hispanic or for white students. They're mostly female, and we see that across campuses that are increasingly female. How many of them say that they're financially dependent on someone else versus being financially independent? Which is a category that matters a lot for financial aid and for eligibility for different kinds of aid. So about half and half. About half are still dependent on their parents, about half are financially independent, and a little more than a third have children of their own. So when we think about the average incoming Native student, likely to be a little bit older than their peers, a little bit more likely to be female, about similar when we think about how likely they are to be a dependent, but a little bit more likely to have children of their own or other dependents. And then in terms of their family background, whether their parents have gone to college or not, about 2/3 are a first-generation college attender. And that's including kind of have your parents attended any college, not just did they get a bachelor's degree. But so most students that were educating across all institutions, the majority of them do not have parents who attended college, but that's particularly true for Native students. And as I'm sure we're all aware, average income for Native students, and so this is coming off of the federal student aid application, so off of the FAFSA, adjusted gross income is lower for Native students than for most other students. And that'll be relevant when we talk about student aid and how likely students are to get different kinds of aid. So, what kinds of institutions do they attend? More than 3/4 of Alaska Native or American Indian students attend public institutions. And that's important because all public institutions have really seen an erosion of state and federal support over the last several decades, particularly if we're talking about non-selective, so institutions that are outside of the top 50. All public institutions have really struggled. Something that surprised me and that maybe surprises you, I don't know if there's anyone here who's a representative of a for-profit institution, but there's an increasing proportion of students who are attending for-profit institutions, and that's something that I've done research on in other contexts, and is something we're thinking about both when we think about what are the things that make for-profit institutions attractive and what kinds of outcomes are students seeing when they attend those institutions. And then about 12% attend a tribal institution. So this is what this looks like relative to other groups over time. So again, Native students are my green line here. And so that's remained relatively flat, a little bit lower than in the past in terms of the percent attending public institutions, but still very reliant on public institutions. And here's the percentage enrolled in for-profit institutions. So the reason this graph has this hump shape relates to federal aid availability for for-profit institutions, and that's a constantly changing landscape. So, we'll see where this goes in the future, but for-profit institutions expanded really rapidly over the 2000s and have increasingly attracted a lot of students. And part of the reason that they've been very successful is that they really target students who are in non-traditional living situations. So more online options, more flexible hours, and also providing degrees that are very targeted to the particular employment opportunities in the area. The downside is that they're really expensive. And so we see a lot of students who end up with really high levels of student debt who attend these kinds of institutions. And so I think this is something worth bearing in mind when we look at the experience of Native students, that many of them are looking for these kind of less traditional alternatives, but may be burdened with really high levels of debt as a result. And then this is just looking at the percentage that are enrolled in tribal colleges and universities. And that's increased a little bit since 2000, but basically stayed between 10 and 12% of all Native students. All right, so lots of students who are at two-year institutions, and degrees are pretty much evenly divided among bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees, and certificates. And that's important because that makes certificates much more relevant for Native students than for other populations. And again, that's something as we think about the needs of tribal communities and employment opportunities for students, making sure those certificates are high quality alternatives and meeting the needs of the local economy becomes really important. So this slide is looking at bachelor's degrees out of all degrees awarded in a year. So all of the degrees that are awarded in a year to students from different demographic groups, what fraction are a bachelor's degree versus a certificate versus an associate's degree. And so again, this green line shows this for American Indian and Alaska Native students. And here you can see that the percent of degrees in terms of bachelor's degrees has actually kind of fallen. So part of that is because, as I mentioned before, we have more students who are enrolling in higher education. So as we have more students that are enrolling, the students who are enrolling now that maybe wouldn't have enrolled 10 years ago might be students for whom a bachelor's degree might be a less attractive option. So this isn't necessarily like a doom and gloom graph, but it does suggest that that rate has kind of been lagging in recent years for Native students. And so understanding whether that's related to difficulties in access or certain kinds of barriers, I think becomes important. So here's the rate for associate's degrees, and you can see that that's up a little bit, so that it was about 30%, and now it's closer to 32%. And of all of these different groups, that rate is higher for Native students than it is for other students. So associate's degrees are relatively more attractive. And again, if we look at certificates, here you can see there's been this increase really since about 2007, where now more than 35%, so more than a third of students who are getting a degree in a year who are a Native student are getting a certificate. Again, not good or bad, just says that's an option that's increasingly attractive to students. So what else makes the institutions that Native students attend distinctive? So this is again looking at that NPSAS survey from 2012. And there are a couple of things that stand out. First, Native students, and nobody here is surprised to hear this. I'm certainly not, being from Montana, surprised to hear that, they're far from home. So students are attending an institution that's, 160 miles away on average, although, for some students it's, of course, much farther than that. But the institutions they attend tend to be smaller, and that's true both certainly of tribal college institutions, but also of traditional state universities or other kinds of institutions tend to have smaller enrollment. And tuition tends to be cheaper at these institutions. So you might think, well, that's great, right? They're attending smaller institutions with lower tuition. That should mean that college is relatively cheaper for this group.
Sorry to be that guy.
No, that's great. I love that guy.
Dennis is already like, you're being that guy. As I'm looking at the data and you're going back and forth, the one survey that you keep referencing in 2012 was 1,000 American Indian and Alaskan Native students. The tribal college data that you were referencing is 17,000 students.
Yep.
So in your opinion, as someone who put this data together, I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around some of these characteristics when some of the schools, like say in Arizona State, the Montana State, those schools have over 1,000 students in 2 schools.
Yep.
So how representative do you feel this data is as we're jumping back and forth between IPEDS, which has much more data, and this 1,008 student survey? That's the part I'm having, these are...
Sure.
these
No,
are
that's a
points
great
to make,
question.
But if they're representative of a state like Montana, yes, it's going to be a lot more.
Right.
So
Right. I would say, so the good thing about the National Post-Secondary Aid Study is it's the only survey that we have that tells us in detail about student aid packages and student characteristics. So it's designed to be nationally representative. It is not designed to be representative at the state level or at the local level. So there was no way I could say, okay, let's look at this, although I'd be super interested to look at it at individual states. So the next wave of this data, that's I think 2018, is supposed to be representative at state levels. And so I'm hoping that a lot of your questions and my questions, it'll be easier to answer with that data. But yeah, that's why I put the 1,000 up there, because I think it's really important to put it as a caveat. So it is best viewed in terms of if we want to compare, on average, students across the nation from different groups, what are some intriguing things that might show up? I think that data is useful for that, but as like, this is reality and the truth, yeah, no. I mean, there are real concerns, so I absolutely agree. I think we had the next presentation is looking at tribal college data in particular, and so hopefully they'll be able to drill down into some more of your questions for that particular population of students. Yeah, thank you. No, that's a great point. All right, so this is the data, this is the main reason that I used this data, is so that we could look a little bit about how students finance their education, because there isn't a lot of information, and we know that student loans and financial aid are becoming an increasingly important part of accessing higher education for many students. So rising tuition throughout the country has led to a lot of concerns for many groups about access to financial aid, and also about the transparency of the financial aid system. And so the questions I don't think we have answers to yet, but hopefully there are some facts that are intriguing, is how well does the financial aid system serve Native students? And how well are Native students able to access and use credit and financial aid? So here are some things that we know. So again, from that same data source, what percentage of students apply for aid? So 87% sounds high. But it's actually not, from my perspective. So that's telling us, 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 is not applying for aid. And if we look at that, relative to, say, Black students who had a similar adjusted gross income, it's low. That there are some students that are not applying for aid. Furthermore, we know from the literature that many students who apply for aid apply too late. So they filled out the form, but they missed the deadlines for the main institutional aid, or they didn't complete it correctly. And so when we look at, well, what percentage actually got a Pell Grant, it's only about half, which that surprised me. That, to me, looks low as someone who looks at these kinds of data. And in terms of what percentage have Stafford loans, so Stafford loans are the federal loans, and they come at preferential rates and are subsidized. So about 40% of Native students have a Stafford loan. And again, my mind is drawn to the comparison between Native students and Black students, again, because the economic characteristics look similar. So about 1 in 4 Native students says in this survey they do not have any source of aid at all. And to me, that seems high. And I just put this in there because I think this is an interesting measure of access to credit. About 40% have a credit card. So how does this stack up relative to income? So this first column shows what tuition and fees are on average across these different groups. And then if we subtract out grants, that's money students never have to pay back, we can look at those numbers relative to income. So this column here shows what are tuition and fees as a percentage of income, and what are tuition and fees after grants as a percentage of income. And these numbers, again, are high. So if we look at how much Native students are having to pay for their educations, if we look at just tuition and fees as a percentage of income, it's about 40%. That's a lot of money. And if we look at tuition and fees after grants as a percentage of income, it's 24%. And you can see that that's, if we look at that relative to white students, tuition and fees are a significant barrier to access. Yeah. So this would be whichever they were declaring on the FAFSA. So if they were a dependent, it would be their parents. If they were independent, it would be their own income. Yeah. The other thing that is interesting in this survey is it asks students whether or not they work while they're in school and whether or not they're attending school full time. And only 55% or maybe that's I don't know if you regard that as a big number or a small number, but more than half of students are working while they're attending school. But that percentage is lower, and I think that speaks somewhat of the employment opportunities in many of the communities in which these schools are located. And 44% are attending full-time, which is lower. So students who are more likely to be attending part-time, but not necessarily more likely to be working. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what are the levels of college attainment, rising, but maybe not as fast as we'd like to see. How do they differ from other groups? More likely to attend for-profit institutions, more likely to attend public institutions, and that financing of education makes it look like tuition and fees are still high relative to income. And so this last point is just looking at what factors promote access to higher education for Native students. So again, there's a lot of research out there looking at different things, so I'll just point at a few. So the research, at least as I'm familiar with it, and probably you have a lot more familiarity with some of these areas than I do, I see as looking at kind of 4 different directions. So one is this K through 12 academic preparation, which I'm not going to talk much about. Another factor that promotes access to higher education is this idea of flexible access. Particularly when we're looking at remote areas, particularly when we're looking at non-traditional students, and thinking about degrees that are responsive to local labor market conditions. A third factor, I would say, is financial support, simplifying the student aid process system, increasing financial education for students so that they feel more confident and more able to access the financial aid that's available. And then the last thing is advising and coaching support in this transition between high school and college, and during the college experience. And one of the things I would say there is a gap that I see for Native students is that because many don't enroll immediately out of high school, there's sort of a gap there in terms of the opportunity to be advised through that process. Okay, so I'm gonna skip some of these. So just talking about that funding issue, as I mentioned, about 3/4 of Native students attend public institutions. Those have had declining state funding. And there's a large body of research now that shows that declining state funding has led to lower completion rates and higher time to degree at those institutions for all students. So I realize none of us are, maybe legislators in this room, but that's an important thing to continue to keep in mind because Native students are more reliant on these non-top 50 public institutions. They're particularly vulnerable to erosion in public funding. again, maybe I'll defer discussion of tribal colleges and universities to the later presentations, but as I'm sure many of you are aware, these institutions are heavily dependent on federal funds. Federal and state funds make up about 71% of funding, and tuition's only about 9%. But if we look at other kinds of public institutions, they have a lot more latitude for increasing tuition. So tuition at a non-tribal college and university two-year institution is about a quarter as opposed to 9%. So that's a good thing. And when we look at those slides that say, well, it looks like tuition is lower for Native students, but a real challenge for those institutions. So more funding issues if a student isn't enrolled in a federally recognized tribe, then the funds do not follow that student. And so that's another funding challenge. And authorized funding and allocated funding have never been aligned, and I'm sure that's something many of you are aware of. In terms of funding issues for students, from the research in general, it seems clear that assistance with aid applications raises college enrollment. Students that are assigned someone who helps them with the FAFSA are more likely to go to college, not just more likely to get aid, but more likely to actually complete the whole process. In research that I've done with some of my coworkers, we've shown that providing students information about what their loans are can actually improve their academic outcomes in college. And that if students have more financial education in high school, that also improves their choice of loan packages. So those are other things to consider. That's not research that's specific to Native students in particular, but when we look at the reliance on the federal aid system, more information about loans and about financial education seems like a place where we can affect some change. And let's see, another point just to reinforce is that many Native students are the first to attend college, and there's a really complex array of funding opportunities for Native students. And so on top of what is already a confusing aid system, may be even more confusing for someone who doesn't have a lot of community support or adult support in terms of figuring out how to navigate that whole system and what other opportunities might be available. So a couple of other researchers in looking at the aid system have said simple and transparent programs, that's the most effective. And so thinking about ways we can make programs and assistance more simple and more transparent, even if the dollars don't change, can improve access. All right, and I'm running short on time, so let me just say there's a lot of good research showing these days that academic support services and coaching support services can be very effective in helping students from disadvantaged groups or first-time college graduates or non-traditional college students, all of those students navigate this system. And most of that ends up being intensive. So intensive support is what makes a difference, but that the returns for that are also particularly promising. So I'll stop there. I think we have time for
Yes,
questions.
let me just say we do. I kind of urged Chris to stop a little bit early, so we do have time for Q&A now. And then after all the sessions complete today, we'll have a moderated discussion at the end too. So you'll get a second chance. We'll probably have you come back up here to the table
Sure.
then. We've got about 10 minutes now though to start. I'm going to give this mic back to Patrice. People will be going around the room to get your questions, and I will take some notes.
I have just a couple of points. I'm Catherine with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. Regarding the data not agreeing, many times with my work with data collection with the tribal colleges, I've found that a lot of times it's a matter of when the data is reported, whether that's whether they've frozen the data or whether we're working with a moving timeline. And it's not wrong. It's just that when you look at data at 3 weeks versus the end of the semester, it's a little bit different, sometimes a lot different. And you're just like triangulating sometimes helps in looking at the outliers and why things are different. And regarding the number of bachelor's degrees declining, I thought that was really interesting because at tribal colleges, in the last 5 years, we've seen an increase of students earning bachelor's degrees.
Yeah, so thank you, Catherine. And I do think, when you look at those graphs together, part of it is that movement of for-profit institutions into that space. So it's not necessarily that students at other kinds of institutions are less likely to get a BA, but that as these for-profits have moved in, they've kind of pulled off students who might otherwise have gotten a BA and are instead getting an associate's degree or a certificate. Again, those may be perfectly, helpful degrees for some people, and I didn't have time to get to it. Certainly, some of the research suggests there can be really good returns to certificates and to associate's degrees, but it's very field specific. So some of those fields have a great, economic opportunities associated with them, and others are not so much. And so thinking more about kind of what fields is it that students are being attracted to, I think can be really helpful. But yeah, thank you.
So I wanted to ask about the part you skipped. The older literature on black-white differences in going to college, finishing college, et cetera. By far, the most important factor is high school preparation. And in the NLSY 79, if you had African-American students with, say, the equivalent of a 1200 SAT score, they went to college and they finished, and sometimes even more than comparable white students. But it was the lack of kids who were actually ready to do college work because of what they had achieved in junior high and before they got to high school. And does that play a large role here, or are the patterns different?
No, that's a great question. So I can wave my hands at it a little bit based on some other research that I've done looking at test scores for different groups. So there's been a lot of research looking at, say, black-white test score gaps and college going. And for Native students, it's really, the patterns are quite strikingly different. So one difference is that the distribution is wider. So students at the top end of in the Native distribution look a lot like students at the top end of the distribution for white students, for example, especially when you control for, kind of some basic characteristics. So family income and things like that can explain a lot of the difference. Where there's been a real erosion is in the bottom tail. So for black students and white students, there's, let's see, I don't want to get too technical here, but there's kind of a shift in the distribution. For Native students, it's wider. And so there's students in Native communities who are particularly disadvantaged, look like they're really struggling, and in the last 10 or 20 years, even more so, have lost ground, where students at the top end have gained ground. So yes, I definitely think academic preparation matters. My understanding is that the Fed is thinking about a K through 12 conference for maybe next year, and so I didn't want to put too much into that. And I'm happy to send you the information that I have if you're interested. But I think it's thinking about both of those pieces. There are some students for whom the system seems to be serving them well, and others that are really losing ground.
So I'm curious about the slides that had the 108 American Indian Alaskan Natives.
That's 1,008, yeah.
Excuse me, 1,008. In comparison to, you were comparing them to Latinx, Black, and white students?
Yep.
Were the numbers similar?
No, they're much smaller. So again, because it's designed to be nationally representative. So Native students were about 1% of that survey, which made them about 1,000 students. So much smaller samples relative to those other populations. So I didn't put the exact numbers up for the other groups, but yeah, generally you're multiplying by a lot. So that's why I didn't put any standard errors up there, because they're big. Yeah.
Hello. In the data that I'm doing for my tribe, what I'm seeing is that a lot of our students are being picked off by private institutions, and they're being given huge scholarships for sports. And with the emphasis on sports, the way that our high school is doing things, it's very likely that many of our students are going to be picked for going to these other places. The sad thing is that they will carry them until they age out, and then it's up to them to do the rest when the cost of a year is about $52,000. So that's the sadness of it, because then after 2 years, they're really into their studies, a 4-year degree that has a lot of promise, et cetera, but then they get dropped because they are no longer sports eligible.
Yeah, I would say that that's not even specific to sports, unfortunately. And I think Randy and I were talking about this earlier today, that I do not have good data on this. I mostly have anecdotal data, but that private institutions, as the cost of a private education has gone up so dramatically, that many institutions are giving generous aid packages in your first year. So a student signs up in their first year and thinks, wow, this is really great. But then come the second year, that aid disappears. And so, a student that I've worked with a lot at Montana State was at Dartmouth for a year, and he came back and because he didn't have the money, and he's gone on to do phenomenal things. He's now a Rhodes Scholar, and I mean he's a student I'm really, really proud of, and is going to be a tremendous asset in his tribal community. But that funding did not continue past that first year. So I think really understanding this whole financial aid system is just going to be increasingly important for many kinds of students. Yeah.
So I'm Yolanda Bisbee with University of Idaho, and I had the opportunity through Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, which is our Pacific Northwest Tribal Consortium, to work with Northwest Educational Regional Labs. Regional Educational Lab. And we did a research study on actually the misidentification of our Native American students. And I think although data is very good, I think it really highlights the need for us to make sure if we walk away with this out of this conference, is the discussion about we are not going to be able to capture numbers on our students accurately until we fix the data. And I think that's gonna, one of the things that we had talked about within our project was really, we went to our affiliated tribes and had a resolution passed to go on to NCAI to talk about this is a big concern, and it needs to be addressed at the federal level, because IPEDS runs everything in regards to our funding and the resources to our tribal students. So when you see this data, I just want to make sure those who aren't aware that these are missed opportunities for our students if we can't get the data right. And so I just wanted to bring that. And I don't know if Laura is with the lab, and I don't know if she wants to add anything to, she's got a website that we can reference. And actually, she's got a copy of the study she's going to bring tomorrow for everybody to see the study and to be aware and advocating that we need to correct that data.
Yeah, if you go to educationnorthwest.org, you can find the report there. We also have a video. The report has been used by several Indian education leaders to make policy changes within their institution. So the report actually lays out some workarounds as we continue to push that the policy needs to be changed as far as how American Indian students are defined. In the meantime, there's ways to improve your system and the data that your school or your institution is capturing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important point, and I think it's one that extends across all the different levels. So, looking at that, the test score data for younger kids, part of what I discovered, so it was based on the NAEP, the National Association of Educational Progress, Assessment of Educational Progress. And schools identify a student, and then the student fills in their own bubble, and the mismatch for Native students is huge, going both directions. So many students that their schools identify as Native and they self-identify a different way, or students who identify themselves as Native and the schools identify them a different way. I mean, so I'm glad to hear, and I'll definitely be looking into more of your work on that, because it's a tremendously important issue. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Barb Ralston from Washington State University, and I've been a part of this same research with Laura and Yolanda. And I think at the very basis is this self-identification. and where really it's a citizenship question, and that's where I think how it should be treated, is as citizens of sovereign nations. But another thing to keep in mind is over the years, as I followed it at our university, is when the policy changes within the university, as well as with national, at what point they introduce this more than one race category. So right there, you've got a shift in how those numbers are going to look. So I don't know, personally, I think until we go to a citizen-based question, rather than the self-identification, we're going to continue to have the data is going to be skewed and inaccurate. Thank you.
So I think I'm hearing that Dick says one more question here.
Got to be a long question then.
Everyone funnel your thoughts over that direction.
Good,
Yeah.
Good questions, good presentation. First on some of the numbers in regard to certificate and associate programs. I'm Russ McDonald, president for United Tribes Technical College, and I think along those lines, since all the tribal colleges, in my mind, I'm wondering, is because the tribal colleges everybody provides certificates and associate's degrees, is that helping those numbers along on that end? We also really realize a lot of our students are going to school, and as someone noted in here, was the first generation, low income, never been to school before. That was the case when I came to my folks had some college but never got a degree, and so we see that happening. But there was really nobody there to tell me how to access the system. So that first year I had a hard time, but once I got that system down, I was making more money scholarship-wise than I was working and pushing that pop cart around a casino, And so I realized that, and then now as a president, we're trying to do that thing and do the same thing there in student services to help our students realize the importance of accessing this system, this bureaucracy, our own even, as well as the other scholarship systems that are available to them out there. I guess it wasn't really a question, more of a statement on that one, but I guess the question is there any way to pull that data out to make that determination in regard to the impact of tribal colleges on what you presented today? So that would be one question. I know he said one, and then the other one is that, and you alluded to a little bit earlier too on a K through 12 meeting, but and not sharing any BIE data. And I think with the reformulation that was been proposed over the past couple of years for that system, and we all know that's needed, how can we use data to help that along, as well as the qualitative data that we could gather from focus groups and so forth to help build that process?
Yeah, both great questions and big questions. So so I don't know that I have a definitive answer for either. So first on your first point about this issue of associate's degrees, certificates, and bachelor's degrees, I would say an associate degree can be a stepping stone to a bachelor's degree, or it can be a diversion, and that's something that the education literature in general has talked about. Like, is providing more opportunities for two-year degrees, does that mean you ultimately end up with a higher level of education for the whole group, or are there some students who end up then just getting the two-year degree who might have otherwise gone on to get a four-year degree? I can't say definitively the degree to which tribal colleges influence that number. I would echo the comment earlier that my sense from the data is that most of the flattening has honestly been related to these private institutions, these for-profit institutions that have largely been two-year certificate institutions, kind of drawing students away into that sector. But certainly I think that's something for tribal colleges and universities to consider, to what degree can they be a pathway and a stepping stone to a bachelor's degree, either by developing those programs at their own university or partnering with other universities. Certainly I know Montana State, as a land grant, has connections with other tribal colleges that are there and should be stronger, and so those are important things to consider. But It is difficult, and I want to be clear that the data issues are not specific to tribal institutions, that when we look at that IPEDS data, two-year institutions in general are a mess. So because they're dealing with a much messier population, that's not a slight on those institutions, but when we look at time to degree and all of that, you know, students are in and out, and it's messy. So I think it's important to look at what we kind of can get as an overall sense of patterns, and that's why I think it's helpful to compare different groups to just sort of get a general picture. But yeah, that's why I brought my salt. So we do have to take all of this with a little bit of a grain of salt, and hopefully I think the efforts that you're alluding to, hopefully we can continue to improve the data so that we can get answers to questions that I think we all have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and she'll be back for the moderated discussion. And David, I think you're up. Where's David? There we go. I'm going to get you mic'd up here. Catherine, you might want to get your microphone too over here. Just come over here. So okay, we'll have David Sanders next from the American Indian College Fund. And after that, Catherine Page from American Indian Higher Education Consortium. Then we'll have, after these two and the Q&A, we'll have the break after this double session.
Can we get the slides up? Okay.
Josh? Good there.
So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself while the slides are getting put up. Oh, they're up. Haumitakepi, David Sanders, Imachiapalo, Oglale Mataha, Malakota. My name is David Sanders. I'm from Oglala, South Dakota. I was born on the Pine Ridge Reservation. I am not an economist, so you will not see a lot of charts or a lot of graphs. My background is in mathematics education. And I came to the American Indian College Fund 4 years ago as a research director, and now I'm the vice president of research evaluation and faculty development at the College Fund. My perspective on this, and it was great to see all the data, because what we're attempting to do at the College Fund is really take a look at the data that we have. And I'll get into this a lot more in this presentation, but as an overview, is to take a look at the type of data that we have on our scholarship recipients, and then ask ourselves, what can we say about our students who represent a large portion of the tribal college students? So the hope is to be able to say something about all tribal college students with the data that we have, but also to speak a bit about the tribal colleges themselves and their role in research, their growing role in research in data and data capacity, and what I think their impact might be on the overall scheme of things when we start talking about the education of American Indians and Alaskan Natives in higher education. I think it's a growing role. It's already been a very important role, but it's a growing role, and I think it will help out the data situation in the coming years. So if you're not familiar with the American Indian College Fund, you can hear me, right, with this? The American Indian College Fund is a nonprofit organization founded in 1989 by the American Indian Higher Education Consortium to essentially be the fundraising arm for tribal colleges and tribal college students. We serve, there's 35 accredited tribal colleges across 13 states. Since 1989, the College Fund has provided more than 119,000 scholarships and almost $170 million to support American and Alaskan Native students. And last year alone, $7.78 million was awarded to 6,578 students in the academic year. We're more than scholarships still. And this is a great start for me when I was starting my role at the College Fund, because we had data in our data system that went back to academic year 2002, 2003. And so we have a lot of students in our data systems, over 30,000 students. But we do more than scholarships. We also have, we established the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs at the American Indian College Fund in 2013. And with that was a real concerted effort to take a look at the type of programming that is occurring at tribal colleges that comes through funding sources that we work with, that we partner with, foundations and so forth, to create initiatives at tribal colleges. And so we have currently 8 major initiatives, and they're all listed. Make sure I got this right down here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but what's interesting is I heard the previous presentation, is a lot of our work, especially in the student success and the student pathways, focuses on assisting tribal college students in the ways that was described, especially with the initiative that we have going on now with intensive coaching. So we're always concerned with how does funding impact student success, and it's a tough question to answer, especially if you don't know all the factors, and being kind of new in this area, and I say new, 4 years seems like a long time, but it's not really when you're trying to establish a context and your database system as well as the overall system. How do you situate yourself in all of this place? And being able to have these things available at the College Fund allows us to take a look at some of those types of things that may impact student success over time. I have this this image up here to kind of show the type of work that's been occurring that I've been undertaking along with others at the College Fund over the last 4 years. And I have this circle here to really show where the effort was on my part. Most of the concerted effort was. As you can see over here, this is really a continuum of a tribal college student from high school graduation to the various pathways into the institution, about the culture, the college-going culture in the community and in the high schools, and then about college choice, where we have initiatives in this area that just started last year. My colleague Matt Macamina will talk about his role in that tomorrow. And then we talk about some of these pathways into the institution and then at the institution, as well as some of the things that we do then with tribal colleges and the things that tribal colleges do on their own to help kind of solidify some of these pathways and success for students. And more lately, we see ourselves in this space. The idea of return on investment for institutions, what happens to students after they leave tribal colleges, what is the economic impact of tribal colleges in the state and the community, and then of course we want to know completion and graduation rates and persistence. Those are types of things that have been established as markers for success. So our work has really focused in this area over the last 4 years. It's gone a lot, it's shifting from student support, even though we're still heavily involved in that area, to also getting into the space of institutional worth. And I don't like using this term worth here because it sounds kind of derogatory. Unfortunately, that's the language that's being used. You have to show your impact. You have to show your impact on student outcomes and employment, and that determines worth. And we can talk about that language at some other time. And I have this down here as well. So we're not just concerned with what's going on at the tribal colleges. Because we are a nonprofit, we have to show our worth. Are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Are we good stewards with the funding that's coming our way to students and to programs? And so my work has also been taking a look at what's going on in the institute, in our organization, around student success, around how we're doing our work, how we're evaluating our programs. I highlight these 3 areas here because there's going to be slides that follow that are going to show some of the data that was similar to what we saw in the previous presentation. So when I came into this position at the College Fund, I really was the man in the cave, right? I didn't know exactly what was going on. My background was mathematics education, so I had to really start to acquaint myself with higher education data, with the types of data that was accessible to us as an organization, and it's kind of grown over time. My understanding of this landscape has grown over time, but I will have the caveat here that all of these sources here, it's not comprehensive by any means. Some of you may have data sources that aren't up here that I could access that will definitely help the story. What's highlighted in blue here are the data that's internal to the College Fund. We have, I mentioned, a lot of students in our database system. We have a lot of demographic data. We have enrollment and graduation information that we've been able to gather over the last 4 years. But we also have access to the ACUS Ames data, which Catherine Page will talk about, I believe, after I'm up. And this is really at the TCU institutional and student level. It's not cohort data. It's descriptive data. There's enrollment data and descriptions of what's occurring at tribal colleges in terms of programs, and among other data points. And so the other data that I think is very important when we start talking about trying to describe TCU student pathways and TCU student success The National Student Clearinghouse figures prominently into this discussion. If you take a look at their research center on their website, they have a lot of studies that they've undertaken over the last, I'd like to say, 10 years. And all of these, they have, of course, their student tracking system database that allows you to track your students, which is what we utilize. So you can get things like enrollment verification, major field of study, graduation data, transfer, and then time, you can calculate time to completion. But they also have the research center. And obviously, we don't have any information on tribal college students in these studies yet. And so the hope is that over time, once all the tribal college system, all the institutions are on the National Student Clearinghouse and submitting data, that over time we can start to use these studies to inform ourselves at the institution level about where our students go, how they succeed elsewhere, and then really that'll get to the institutional worth over time. Of course, there's IPEDS, there's Nces data. There are college going rates in these things that we access, high school graduation rates, American Indian and Alaskan Native higher education statistics. And then, of course, there's the Penn Center for Minority Serving Institutions. And these really help to highlight the benefits of attending a tribal college in TCU Worth. So in regards to American Indian and Alaskan Native college readiness and college going rate, there's some data that is available. And I don't know if all of you are familiar with this data already. So some of this is probably in your knowledge field. What's interesting to me, and it probably makes sense, there's not any American Indian and Alaskan Native data on college enrollment rates. And we became aware of this over the last couple of years. So we don't know what's happening to our students once they graduate high school, whether the rates are going into college. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the data points. We can talk about American Indian and Alaskan Native college enrollment, college participation rates from NCES. And I don't know if this agrees with the data points that we saw earlier with the presentation, but these are the values. Oops. These are the values here. These are the values here. And then we have the American Indian and Alaskan Native post-secondary enrollment. And so we see some figures like this: 132,300 American Indian and Alaskan Natives enrolled undergraduate students across the nation in 2015. And we saw a figure in the previous presentation that there was like 11%, and that kind of that jives with what I have here in regards to the amount of American Indian and Alaskan Native students enrolled in tribal colleges as a percentage of the overall American Indian and Alaskan Natives enrolled at the undergraduate level. And in terms of college completion, we see some stats here. For the American Indian and Alaskan Native students who graduated in 4 years, 23%. For white students, compared to white students, it's 43%. For those that have graduated in 5 years, it were 13%, compared to white students, who were 16%, additional students. In terms of the percentage of full-time, first-time students who graduate with 150% of normal time to completion for the program, we have an average graduation rate for 2-year TCUs at 20.6%, and an average graduation rate for 4-year TCUs institutions at 24.7%. And the reason I mention all of these stats is because in my work, what I'm trying to do is take our data and situate it into the overall national data. And it's a tough thing to do, considering some of the obstacles that were already discussed earlier, especially in terms of enrollment, tribal enrollment, and self-identification. Here's the only the chart I have here. So how do you go about demonstrating institutional worth? I mentioned earlier doing economic impact studies, and if you're not familiar with some of the work that has already been done in this area, AHEC sponsored a study in 2015 on return on investment and economic impact studies across the TCU system. There are state impact institutions within certain states in North Dakota, Wisconsin, South Dakota, among others, have done economic impact studies at the state level. And then AHEC also sponsored a study back in 2000 on economic growth. In terms of return on investment, the Penn Center for Minority Serving Institutions has some studies that have been produced over the last few years, which talk about return on investment, but they're not actual return on investment studies in the traditional sense. And so the other part of this is what's occurring at the national level in terms of surveys that are being offered to students to help show institutional worth. The Gallup-Purdue Index is a survey that surveys college graduates and asks them certain questions about their experience at the post-secondary level. Unfortunately, we don't have any students from tribal colleges who were involved in that study. And so what we're trying to do then is to find these areas to partner with some of these organizations to produce some of this information. So I mentioned earlier, we're not all about scholarships. We're about programming. And so what we found over time with our programs is that when we fund a project from a foundation that comes through us and we institute that program at a tribal college, we notice that there's a lot of important information and a lot of programming that comes out of this that's not necessarily shared out. And what we're trying to do as an organization is we're trying to work with tribal college faculty and staff to be able to bring this information out as not just best practices, but also as research to be able to add to the body of literature. And so what we're doing is we're working in such areas as early childhood education, faculty development, and we're producing information at these institutions that are place-based that we can add information to the whole body of knowledge. I think for us, again, we have done several things to help meet this end. And one of the things that we've done is that we supported faculty in the completion of dissertations. We've had 27 faculty who have completed dissertations through our faculty development programs, with 11 in progress right now. And so what we're trying to do with this is to take a look at the role of faculty at tribal colleges to assist them in the development of their own research, and then to be a source of dissemination for those studies. And so what you'll see, we have a research repository that we're creating. We're going to house this information in that research repository so that everybody has access to the type of research that's occurring at tribal colleges. We also have published a journal, an annual journal called the Tribal College and University Research Journal. We've produced 2 volumes of that. And again, we work with tribal college faculty who are doing research at tribal colleges to give them an avenue of dissemination and to share that out more broadly with the national, with folks like yourself who are interested in research at tribal colleges. And then in our own organization, we're looking at taking a look at our students and developing surveys that can help assist the data gap, the lack of data that's available on our students. And those are actually in progress right now, and we are working with economists to take a look at the analysis of those pieces. We host tribal college faculty research convenings, again, focusing heavily on tribal college faculty to bring out the research that they're doing at tribal colleges to share out more broadly with each other. And so what does all of this tell us? It tells us that, as we all know, American Indian Alaska Native TCU students are and aren't represented in the data, as discussed previously. What we're seeing is that we have access to over 6,000 students annually, which gives us a great opportunity to do research and to ask questions of our students and to get information about their pathways over time and really inform our own work at the College Fund. We don't have a complete picture of TCU student pathways yet. We don't know enrollment patterns, transfer patterns, time to completion, post-graduation employment, wage earnings, and tribal impact. And these are some of the things that we are trying to rectify over time in developing these surveys, and hopefully be able to share out publicly with you all. We are also trying to situate our story in the national data, as I mentioned earlier, which seems to be a piecewise model at best. And one of the things that I want to highlight in here is that over time, I think organizations like the College Fund have come to understand that we should take some ownership in the lack of data that's out there. We should produce some information, some data, because we have access to students, we have access to institutions and programs at tribal colleges. And so our effort is really trying to make sure that we take, I don't want to say advantage, but we take advantage of the opportunity to work with students to produce that data, which in turn will help rectify some of the data issues nationally. And then the important thing in all of this is that I feel like in working with other organizations, American Indian organizations, nonprofit organizations, they feel the same way about the data. They have a lot of data stored in their databases that hasn't been touched or hasn't been used. And so they've come to realize that that's a great source of information that should be shared out eventually. And so there's a growing network of nonprofits, American Indian nonprofits, who are embarking on that work. And that's all I have.
Thank you, David. We're going to go right to Catherine, and then we'll have questions for both of them after Catherine's presentation.
I'm going to start us with a story. David, an enrolled member of the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, is a student at College of the Menominee Nation in Kashina, Wisconsin, pursuing a technical diploma in welding. He attends full-time and is a straight-A student. In 2001, when David was a junior in high school, his first child was born. The boy was premature and spent the first 6 months of his life in and out of the NICU. Am I close enough? Okay, that a little bit closer. This caused a lot of stress for David and his then girlfriend, now wife. He struggled in school and didn't earn his diploma until a month after his graduation date. Afterwards, David worked as a dairy farmer for nearly 15 years. As he worked on the farm over the years, he noticed a lot of welding having to be done on machinery and for basic projects around the farm. The welding piqued his interest, and he thought that maybe this would be a good career. He tried some of the small projects around the farm and then decided to enroll in college to pursue welding formally. David's family was his motivation. His wife has always been there for him through the good times and bad. No matter what happens, she pushes him through to continue to achieve his goals. They have 3 children now, and David serves as a role model as they reach for their own dreams. David's mother raised 2 boys on her own, and she inspired David to go back to school, and she is also a student at College of Menominee Nation, so she shows that it's never too late to go back to college. As an enrolled tribal member, it was easy for David to choose CMN because it was close to home. CMN has exceeded David's expectations, and he feels that the college has fully prepared him for the future. Upon completion of his studies, David will pursue a career as a pipe welder. Pipe fitting is one of the most challenging welding areas, but David likes a challenge. He believes that this career will make him financially stable and able to provide for his family. And he says, "I feel success is right in front of me. All I have to do is go and get it." Where did David begin his academic journey? I have slides. That's David. Where did he begin his academic journey? What challenges did he face? What factors helped him succeed? Where's David going with his career and his studies, and will he be successful? Data can answer these questions, and seriously, a good pipe fitter will never lack for work. I'm Catherine Page, Research and Policy Associate with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. I manage the AHEC Ames initiative. AHEC Ames, the American Indian Measures of Success initiative, is a data collection initiative that was created by American Indians for American Indians and is relevant to American Indians. It was created by AHEC with a group of stakeholders from the American Indian College Fund, from the Bureau of Indian Education, tribal colleges and universities, the accrediting agencies, the Department of Ed, and various other groups. And it was created to capture the information that accurately reflects what's going on at the tribal colleges and universities. Back in the days before there was such a call to be driven by hard numbers, before all of the accountability measures were so strict, AHEC would advocate for the tribal colleges, and we would use stories and we would relay all of the success. The successes and the challenges as updates and stories. But increasingly, as you know, with all of the demand for quantifiable outcomes to justify continued support of the projects and programs, it's become more important to have data. It's critical, though, that we share the successes of American Indian students, particularly in this political climate. The data and the stories behind the data have never been more important. And that's where AHEC Ames comes in. This collection was developed to tell the tribal colleges' stories in a way that iPads, for example, cannot, in a way that gets at the heart of what the tribal colleges are and why the colleges do what they do. AHEC uses the data every single day to advocate for the colleges, to Congress, and to other federal agencies and to others using these data. AHEC Ames has been up and running since about 2004. In 2006, we presented our first set of aggregate data about the tribal colleges to Congress, and that year, the funding for the tribal colleges went up by $5 million because we were able to demonstrate the need. We were able to demonstrate what the colleges are doing, and we started to be taken seriously and recognized. AHEC Ames is both qualitative and quantitative. The stories enrich the numbers and put them into context, and the numbers demonstrate and back up the stories in black and white. Both are absolutely necessary. In the quantitative portion, AHEC Ames is unique amongst the compliance reports in that if the information doesn't fall within parameters of the cells as particularly defined, or if there's supplemental information that can help describe what's going on with the numbers, there is space in the report to expand upon, explain, and share, and that explanation is really important. It's very rich, and it really makes the tribal colleges stand out in really wonderful ways. The qualitative information is crucial. Yes, we have 9% of our tribal college students are married with dependents. We have 12% who are enrolled in vocational and career programs, and 25%, there we go, 25% that are aged 25 to 34, and 31% are American Indian male. David, our father of three, non-traditional student in CMN's welding program, he's a living person who brings those numbers to life. So real people, real reasons to make legislation go this way or that way, and real reasons to make sure that a program is funded. As a side note, just for clarification, when AHEC talks about American Indian students, we're talking about enrolled members of federally recognized tribes or the biological children of enrolled members, because the federal funding is tied to that particular definition. So sometimes you'll find that the numbers with IPEDs won't necessarily match up even with just the number of American Indian students, because we're a little bit more narrowly focused necessarily. So what do the data tell us about our American Indian students? There's so much. It was really hard to pick just a few points, so I'm going to focus on success. The tribal colleges, here we go. The tribal colleges, they make good financial sense. Where else can you get a world-class education and a bachelor's degree in elementary ed or environmental science for $3,600 in tuition and fees? 4 of our colleges have the lowest tuition and fees in the nation. Only two tribal colleges participate in the federal student loans, and students are encouraged not to go into debt. Not only are the colleges a good deal for the students, but they're also a good deal for the tribe, the nation, and the state. A couple of years ago, as David mentioned, we had an economic impact study conducted of the tribal colleges and universities. The company conducting the study found that for every $1 invested by the federal government, the federal return on investment was $2.40. The student return on investment was $4.10, and the ROI for the state, $5. The TCUs save the federal government nearly $200 million every year in social program savings, and alumni generate at least $2.3 billion in added income every year. And that's just what we know. Employment data, as David mentioned, is sparse. It's often very difficult to follow up with alumni. If more employment data was available, the numbers, I think they would definitely be higher. As more colleges join the National Student Clearinghouse, the tracking will get easier, and the numbers will improve, and we'll have a more complete picture. Let's see, is the next slide? Yeah. In some circles, there's a negative perception about TCU students and TCUs. A couple of years ago, during a briefing on Capitol Hill, a gentleman stood up and asked a question that amounted to, "Why are your students failing?" Ouch. And By what comes out of iPads, it may look like the students are failing. TCUs are not degree factories. Many of our students take longer than the 2 years to complete an associate's degree, longer than the 4 years to complete a bachelor's degree. Looking at first-year data, retention data from our own data sets, TCUs lose more than half of their first-time entering students in the first year. But when you dig down a little bit further into the numbers, we do get a story of persistence and success. The tribal college students by no means are failing. For example, here we have the developmental successful completion. Significantly fewer students, first-time entering students, were placed into developmental math in 2015-16 than were placed in 2014-15. Based on their placement test scores. In 2014-15, 71% of first-timers taking the test placed into developmental math. Yet a year later, only 63% of first-timers were placed. And you'll see here, there's a huge difference in the, in the completion, the successful completion between 2014-15 and 2015-16. And when we're talking successful completion, we're talking about C or better. With this kind of data, this is just a small example, we can track successful course completion in developmental ed and in the gen eds. We're looking at concerns and accomplishments. The numbers are a starting point. Is there a drop, for example, or is that is it a drop? Is the drop significant, or is it just a rotten year? Which students are doing better or worse? In particular, is it American Indian males, American Indian females, non-Indians? Is success or lack thereof tied to a teaching style or time of day? The faculty are looking at these things. The data spur questions for continuous improvement, and the colleges use this in program review and as helping as a guide for the faculty and to improve student learning outcomes. Looking at our women in tribal colleges, 63% of tribal college students are female. 54% of TCU students are American Indian female. Of that 54% of American Indian females, more than half are first generation. Nearly half are single moms. The same amount are in the years 25 to the 49 age range, independent, child rearing, working adult age. And yeah, more than half of them are beyond the traditional college age range. Their average salary is $20,567. That's near poverty. Add in kids and elders at home, how far does that money go? 86% of all TCU students receive Pell. And what does that mean? That in spite of many being the first in their families to attend college, having children to raise, having family obligations, having to work, and being dirt poor, more than half of the graduates, of all of the graduates at TCUs are American Indian females. These women are earning degrees in education, in business, in healthcare, and more. And 60% of all bachelor's degrees at TCUs are earned by American Indian females. Our students take a little longer, but the fact that they keep coming back after a stop out and they keep plugging away bit by bit until they complete, that's success. We get a fair number of students who are using their experience at a tribal college as a springboard or a stepping stone to a mainstream institution. They're not there for a terminal degree. They're there for their basic classes before going on to another degree at another school. And this is common for all community colleges. It's not just the tribal colleges that this is happening at. So the students transfer out to another college after getting the classes that they want. That's success. And there is necessarily a lot of focus on the degrees, on the terminal degrees, and the graduations. They're important. But also important and often overlooked are non-degree seeking students, are students who are there for enrichment, who are there for just a few classes for this reason or that reason, work, whatever. And nearly all of them finish what they start. If you're not in college for a degree and you're finishing the classes you want to take with a passing grade, that's success. The TCU students are finishing what they start, whether it's a degree, a certification, an endorsement, or coursework. And what are they doing with their education? They're getting jobs in the community. They're teachers, nurses, counselors, college faculty and staff, tribal college presidents, tribal council members. These community workers, they know the value of a tribal college education because they attended one. Nearly a quarter of tribal college personnel graduated from a tribal college. 90% of nursing students from Oglala Lakota College are certified RNs. Salish Kootenai College has produced over 200 AIN nurses and over 450 AIN dental assistants. Lakoutere, Ojibwe Community College reports 96% placement of healthcare graduates in jobs and 100% employer satisfaction. These students and graduates are role models for their own children and those with whom they work. The TCUs are transforming communities and their families and the tribal nations. They serve more than 160,000 American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and others during the academic year through academic and community-based programs. The data that AHEC collects each year has helped keep the tribal colleges and universities from being as negatively affected by federal budget cuts. When the president's budget recommended cutting $7 million from Haskell Indian Nations University and Southwestern Indian Polytechnic Institute, the Bureau of Indian Education's 2 post-secondary institutions, it was the data that helped keep that funding from disappearing. If they'd been cut, they would have had to shut their doors. The numbers collected every year, they help make the case to Congress and to others that these colleges and universities are worth funding. Do I have time for one more story? Okay. So I will leave you with one more story. One of a student, he's a graduate, he's a staff member, a faculty member, all rolled into one. Dwayne Bedell, a Bay Mills Indian community member, has been working in tribal communities for 20 years. Currently, Dwayne is the Computer Information Systems Department Chair and a faculty member at Bay Mills Community College. In addition to his roles at BMCC, Dwayne teaches undergrad courses at Lake Superior State University and graduate courses at University of Michigan and the University of New England. Dwayne started his schooling at Haskell Indian Junior College, which is now at Haskell Indian Nations University, in 1991. In 94, he moved up to Brimley, Michigan to raise his family without finishing his studies at Haskell. In 96, he enrolled in the Computer Information Systems program at BMCC, which he completed 2 years later. After completing that degree, he was hired by the Intertribal Council of Michigan as an IT director. During his tenure there, Dwayne was asked to teach intro to computer courses at BMCC. He fell in love with education. So when the opportunity presented itself to work full-time in education, he grabbed the opportunity at BMCC. In addition to his chair and faculty responsibilities, Dwayne has he has been and continues to be involved with campus activities. He supports students as a faculty advisor for the AHEC Club. He sits on BMCC's Curriculum Faculty Improvement, Marketing, and Retention Committees. And he shares his experience with American Indian students as a mentor in the American Indian Science and Education and Engineering Society, the ACES mentoring program. He wants to give back to his community through education. He's focused on working with American Indian students to ensure that they are able to achieve their academic, personal, and professional goals. And he now is working on his EDS and EDD degrees, and he plans to pursue an administrative position in education with the goal of encouraging American Indian students to complete their studies and so that they can become leaders. The gifts that tribal college students return to their communities are immeasurable by any data collection instrument, but the data about them and their activities helps to keep the colleges funded and working to help those students live productive lives and to give back to the communities they love. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could take a seat, Catherine and David, you want to come up? We'll have Q&A. I'll just take a seat over there.
I just have a quick, Karen Diverell, I have a quick comment on the congressional aide who wanted to give advice about what alumni and tribal government should do. Can you whisper their name in my ear later? I'm going to stop by and visit them and school them on the trust responsibility.
Thank you. we try to do that often. We know that there are questions out there.
I'll take the opportunity, if I may. And Catherine, your data sound interesting, and maybe David, both. Can you explain, for those of us who like to work with data, are there opportunities for outside scholars to work with you on the data? I don't know whether there are maybe some reasons why that's difficult. Can it be done? Do you do that? How do you, if someone's interested, how would they proceed?
I think for me, it's working with, it depends on what we're trying to do. So if it's a national survey, we're going to work with a Gallup organization, for instance, or if it's a ROI, we'd work with the American Institutes for Research. In terms of, we do hire consultants to work with us to develop literature reviews, to do evaluation work for us. And then in terms of analyzing the data, we haven't yet used an outside person or organization.
AHEC Ames is primarily an in-house production. We produce the survey every year. We survey the tribal colleges. It is their annual report to AHEC. If you're interested in the data or working with us, come talk to me. Pretty much, we can maybe figure something out. And later this year, we will have a publication with the most recent tribal college data coming out.
Yeah, and in our programming, we do work with tribal college faculty to help implement those programs at the institutions who produce research and data on the impact of the programs at the institutions.
While we're waiting for a question here, I was curious from the audience perspective here, how many attendees here attended a tribal college or university and graduated? Can you stand up? That's great. Good. Thank you. Secondly, how many tribal members that attended either the tribal college or another university and graduated? Could you also stand up as well? A public university as well.
It's really impressive.
That's wonderful. Thank you. There was a question over here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm Adam Stern with the Department of Interior. And I had a quick question about the economic impact studies. I was just curious how your organization uses the results of those studies. Is it just to help on the Hill, or what are some ways that those results are utilized?
The way that I'm aware of right now is using it on the Hill. I'm not aware of all of the uses that we've been able to use it for. But if you're interested, I can probably get that information for you.
Mine was just you talked a little bit about iPads and Clearinghouse, and I know we've been in there about 2 years now. Mm-hmm. And so, but what we're seeing and what we're hearing in some of the presentations that we've been at is that the Clearinghouse data tends to be a little bit more accurate rather than the iPads. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you could share a little bit about that. The other one I just wanted to help along this lines too is that we present the data, and I know we're going to meet here in a couple weeks on the Ames. But on the Ames stuff is that I know among the tribal college presidents, and we're the board for AHEC, is that we're having discussions in regard to making this more user friendly for us, because it shouldn't just be the outcome of the effort should not just be to present on a Hill, but it also should be the usability of the membership. Absolutely. So I think as we move forward, those discussions I've already started, and we'll continue.
As far as iPads, I think that with iPads, I think for a lot of community colleges, it just, as Chris mentioned, it's messy. It doesn't represent the definitions and the way that formulas are set up. They just they're really more focused on mainstream four-year institutions. It's mainly for that. And that really doesn't translate when you have commuter populations. Many of our institutions, of community colleges in general, are part-time, and they are more focused on not a terminal degree or the associate's degrees. And there's a lot of transferring out, there's a lot of in and out, and I think that's where some of the sloppiness comes from, and the not usability for, at least for iPads, comes in with tribal college data. With the Clearinghouse, I think it's if you're putting in, exactly what's happening with the transfers. You're putting in where people are going. I think it's easier to track more individual students. And if someone is more schooled on this than I am, please speak up. But it seems to be just a little more precise and a little more individual. And there's more of an ability to tweak things.
Yeah, and I think there's more interaction between the institution and National Student Clearinghouse. It's not once a year or once a semester. It's like every month or every 3 months, depending on what your agreement is. So there's more real-time data in that system.
OCO, my name's Jessie Lackey. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I attended Haskell Indian Nations University and graduated with my bachelor's degree from there in American Indian Studies, and now I'm a graduate student at the U here in a PhD program in Natural Resources Management. But I was thinking about how we're collecting data on our students, and I know that when I went to Haskell, our local newspaper liked to nail us all the time for dropout rates. And from my interaction with other students is we did have a lot of students dropping out. But what was happening was that they were going back home to help families and their communities for a period of time and then returning. And I know that that's a lot of the times a more cultural specific to American Indian Alaska Native students. And so I'm wondering if that's being captured in any kind of way to kind of explain as to maybe why, to give a little bit of a better picture of what's going on with our students, along with, them being mothers or fathers or coming from low income. That would be a part of it, I guess.
Qualitatively, yes, the particular reasons for stop-outs, but quantitatively, no, not yet.
And I think with the development of our surveys, we're going to get at some of that information.
Could you expand on that? What would it take to do a better job?
Go ahead.
To do a better job of?
Well, you said you can do it qualitatively, but not quantitatively. What would you need to do more? Maybe that can't be articulated real well. Maybe that's not a good question.
Finding the right questions to ask.
I guess if I can just weigh in here, at least at my own institution, I'm Brian Brayboy, I'm at Arizona State University. As soon as students leave your institution, by federal guidelines, whether they go to another college or not, they're considered dropouts. So this is really fundamentally about how you change the definition about what constitutes a dropout rather than, I think the qualitative stories are certainly important, but there's also something about how do we begin to make sense of our students leaving and coming back and sort of moving from 4 years back to sort of reverse transfer and vice versa. I don't think that we yet, for me, one of the themes from these last two sessions is really we need better, more data that work for us to be able to figure out how to move forward with some of this. So I think it's fundamentally about how the government decides to define what a dropout is.
Russ McDonald again. I'm on a research committee for AHEC too, so kind of coming from that perspective. But I agree with those statements. We see that within the iPads is that when somebody transfers out, and we heard it in the previous presentations today, is that students come to us just for the general eds, and then they leave. And so it's a step on to one of the universities within the school system, within the state. And so, but we don't get to count those. So if they graduate from NDSU, pick on him. If they graduate from NDSU, then what happens then is that NDSU gets to count them, we don't. So those are some of the challenges, but I think that has to be put into the data. So in regard to question from our recorder over here is that I think the process is just has to begin maybe a new maybe to try and build on what's established right now to revamp it and to make it more user friendly to everyone. But I think you just use established processes for doing that. We would do focus groups or something with using some kind of nominal group technique where we determine, when we talk about nominal, we're just talking about prioritizing what's the priorities for the issues that come up in regard to building the process, the methodology, and then use that to give guidance and to put together some type of standardized quantitative tool, some type of survey instrument, and then have some type of evaluation component added onto that to make sure we're on the right track. And over a period of several iterations of that work, then you could refine that process to get down and make sure that we're on the right track with that.
Thank you, you guys. My name is Shelley. I'm at Harvard University, and I have a question for both of you. It's great that there will be more data and that there's more data being collected. I'm wondering if you have review boards to kind of control how the data will be used and how those review boards are set up. And do you work with the individual tribes with tribal colleges on some of that?
It depends on the tribe. Some tribal colleges are their tribe's institutional review board, and so we'd work directly with them. Or we'd work with Northwest Indian College, which has been established as the IRB for tribal colleges who don't have IRBs. And so as an organization, we would work with Northwest Indian College and their IRB.
Yeah, if the data required it, we would go through Northwest Indian College's our IRB as well. But mostly for us working with the aggregate data, it's not usually required because it's not student specific.
I would take one more question.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Kunish-Podine. I'm an educator at a middle school here in Minnesota, as well as a state legislator. And I guess my question for you and for anybody else that would like to respond, what is one or two things that would be your biggest ask for your state legislators as far as assisting in getting our students, Native American as well as our non-Native students through and successfully completing secondary education? And we're talking now about it doesn't always mean a 4-year degree. Sometimes it's a technical degree or something like that. But what would be your, top 2 asks to your legislators?
That's a tough one. Right over there.
Sounds like a president question. And my name is Cynthia Lindquist. I am president of Chandesca-Chistana Community College, Little Hoop up in Fort Totten, North Dakota, Spirit Lake, Dakota. That's a great question. Show me the money. And let that money follow those students, no matter where they go. And quit, there's these artificial barriers. We all want the same thing. I don't care what color we are, for our young people to be successful and to have those opportunities. We're faced with a lot more challenges in our system, in our communities, obviously, in that. And so we need money. That's free, that's flexible, and preferably that follows the student. We're trying to do that to a certain extent within the AHEC system and the college fund. We have some limited resources in that, but if the student is not aggressive and passionate, and like President McDonald mentioned, figuring it out for himself, and that's what all of us have to go through, but somehow there's a great synergy going on right here. Can't we figure what that is? And then North Dakota treated us terribly. It's hard to talk about. And it was reaction to DAPL. But even that, I've been around a long time, and I've worked with the state legislature for most of my whole life. They're sitting on, what, $4 billion in that legacy fund, and they're not touching it. They're not doing anything with it for any young people in North Dakota. And so how do you wake up legislators to realize, there's our potential and fun education, no matter what that is, and open those doors. I mean, we only have 730,000 people. How much money do we need in a rainy day fund? Sorry, I could digress.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Kayla Yang Best, and I'm with the Bush Foundation. The foundation works in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and 23 Native nations that are in the area as well. And I apologize. I know this is focused on higher education, and so I apologize in advance. I'm going to expand that just a little bit with my question here. And my question is to the panelists up there and folks in the room. I'd love to connect with you later too. Is to what extent do you think your students' their experience in K-12 impact their success or performance in TCUs or in higher education generally? And do you track that data? Do you know what happened in that experience, at what needs to happen and to change as they move forward in that continuum of learning? And if you don't, do you have any advice on who does that well? Because I think that continuum is really important to understand as we help Native kids move from K-12 into later learning, whether that's 2-year or 4-year degree.
We don't track that information, and I don't know who does it well. I do know we try to track the input into tribal colleges, not just those students who are coming from high school, but from GED programs who didn't finish high school. And I think the tribal colleges do an amazing job with students who didn't finish high school and who come at them not really prepared for college. And then it's amazing to see what happens to them when they go through the system and come out the other side. But no, I don't know who does that well at that level.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that.
I'd like to answer this question from Legislator Kunish. My name is Gerald White. I am an educator at Deer River Public School in Minnesota, northern Minnesota. I teach 9th to 12th graders, and I counsel 7th to 8th graders. I've been working with a group in the Twin Cities here called the Teachers of Color and American Indian Teachers. I think from my experience, I've been there for 12 years now, and I spent 20 years working for the tribe. So, and I got a degree in biology. I also got an education degree. And we need teachers that look like our kids. We have 450 plus Native kids in our district, and we have about, I think we have 5 teachers, Native teachers in our district, and that's a high number for a northern Minnesota school. So we need a lot more support for getting educators in the classroom, Native educators and other people of color. So we had some legislation this past summer that went through the system, and we did get $384,000, I believe, for teachers of color. So, but we need a lot more than that. And if you need any discussion points to present to your colleagues, I work with people at Metro State University, Paul Spies, and we got a whole working group over there. I think it's very important that we look at that specifically as Native educators working with our kids. When they see us work in front of the classroom, I think that really makes a huge impact on our kids, because they're so used to seeing non-natives telling us what to do, basically, in education, social services, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a lot of work to do. Over 90% of our students Native students go to public school, and less, maybe 7% go to tribal schools in Minnesota here. So we got a huge number, and I think we have around 200 Native teachers, and that's pretty low. So my suggestion would be to focus on that area. You know, if you want to work with some of the tribal colleges and the universities. There's 4 universities in the state of Minnesota that get funds for teacher education programs, specifically Native. So I'm not really sure what goes on there. So thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Okay, I'm really glad to see that we've got good question and answers coming. Let's thank the presenters again. We'll take a break now. We're just a tiny bit behind. I think that's okay. We'll try to be back in about 10 minutes, about 3:45. But get a bathroom break and a little refreshments.
I'm going to ask people to take their seats so that we get to that reception on time, more or less. Thank you. Just going to check, is this the lapel mic is working too? Good. Okay, I think I'm going to start winding up here. Again, I want to keep us kind of on time for our reception. We've talked a lot today so far about the data on students at college, students coming into college, and graduation rates and things like that. I'm going to talk now a little bit about some of the data we have that inform us on what happens afterward. So I'm going to talk evidence about American Indian, Alaska Native student experiences after college graduation. I'm going to draw on 3 papers primarily. One of them I was part of with Jacob Weiss and Carolyn Liebler, looking at occupational structure of the American Indian and Alaska Native workforce. I'll also be drawing on a paper done by Amy Peterson and Christine West with help from Chris Shalander. Christine is here in front. You want to just wave, Chris? Yeah, Chris, if you want to talk to Christine about that paper, she'll be back tomorrow. I think she has to run tonight. But that's about returns to education, college education for American Indian and Alaska Native students especially. And the final paper is by Alessia Liebert, who's with the state of Minnesota, a good job after college. Alessia could not be here today, but she will be here tomorrow. So what I don't know, you can direct to Christine and Alessia and also access the papers directly. But I think what they're telling us is basically this, that degree completion by American Indian and Alaska Native adults has indeed risen in recent decades, but it's still too low. We saw that already today. It's still, there are gaps. It's not where we'd all like it to be. That contributes, I think what we'll find, that contributes to outcomes afterward, to gaps compared to, let's say, non-Hispanic whites, in the rates of employment, in income levels, and in occupational choice. There are good incentives for American Indian and Alaska Native young adults to go to college. The returns or the income that college grads earn compared to high school graduates is indeed strong for Alaska Natives and American Indians, just as it is for other groups. So that same kind of high return is there, but it's not as high. The returns for American Indian and Alaska Native graduates appear to be lower. They're high, but not as high as for non-Hispanic whites. And we need to address and understand those gaps in completion and post-completion outcomes. So first of all, we've already seen quite a bit about this degree completion. I'll just add a little bit here. Rightly or wrongly, I did use the American Community Survey, such as it is, to break out in the recent years both American Indian, Alaska Native reporting that single race alone versus those reporting it in combination. Earlier years, you can't do that. If you go back to 1980, up here at the top, you see BA and BA plus, pretty small sliver of the American Indian workforce with those levels of degrees. That increases over time, but it also increases over time for the whites, shown in the gray. So that, what you have here is that by 2010, the multiple race American Indians are about on par with where the whites were, let's say in 1990, in terms of their BA completion or more. The single race American Indians are still, well behind where the whites were back even in 1990. Where you do see a less of a gap, more of a closure, is, as we heard earlier today, the some college. The portion of both populations here with some college is pretty high, even compared to the whites, but the BA and BA plus is still lagging. And that matters, and I'll get into that less of a review now and more into new material. So this is the work that I was part of, and I know you can't see everything here, and that's okay. I'll explain. We've got 26 occupations here, running from the left to the right. These are the higher skilled occupations measured by the tendency of people who hold these occupations to have at least some college education. By that same measure, whether the workers have some college education, the occupations over here are less educated. So at the far end is farming, fisheries, and forestry, the lowest percentage of workers with a college exposure. Over in the far left, you have architecture and engineering, the highest percentage with some college. Then you've got life sciences, physical sciences in here, legal in here, a lot of STEM plus legal over here. Over here you've got farming, you've got buildings and grounds maintenance, mining or extraction, constructions, jobs like that. So that's the occupational range. This over here on the vertical scale, if it's below this 0 line, down here, that means American Indians are underrepresented, typically in here by about 50% in these high skill occupations. And over here, where it's above the 0 line, they're overrepresented by 50, they're 50% or double what the white representation is as a proportion of the workforce. So they're overrepresented in the lower skilled occupations, underrepresented in the higher skilled occupations. That pattern's been stable for decades, more or less. You do see some exceptions. Community service and social work is an area where American Indian workforce gravitates, along with protection services. Somewhat overrepresented in the military, as is widely known, I think. But this is a pattern of concentration in the less skilled occupations, and we find in trying to analyze that pattern that the previous results here of lower degree completion are important in explaining the relative concentration in the low-skilled occupations. Perhaps not a surprise, but we did kind of confirm it with some multivariate correlational analysis. We can't say totally this is a causal result, but it makes at least sense that the education is the biggest factor that statistically correlates with this concentration in the low-skilled occupations, the lack of degree completion. Moving on to the paper by Christine and Amy on the returns to college education, I've said what we've got here is 49% is darn good, but 60% is better. Basically what they find in their analysis, again looking at lots of variables, is that an American Indian worker with a college degree earns almost 50% more than an American Indian or Alaskan Native worker with a high school degree. That's a big premium. It's a big benefit from getting a college degree. However, for whites, it's 60%, that same gap. So it's big, but it's not as big as it is for whites, which is a little bit of a puzzle. They look into this. They find that, if you control for occupation, you can statistically explain some of that, but not all of it. They find that these patterns don't seem to be changing a lot over time, just as we found with the occupational choice itself, and that they're more severe for males and in urban areas. The occupational disparities that I showed you are also generally more severe for males. Christine and Amy conclude that their results are consistent with the possibility of labor market discrimination. For the same kind of problems they had, that I had, that they didn't have good experimental data, we can't claim that that's pinned down causally. But you try to explain the differences with a lot of controls, and you cannot fully explain the gaps. So it makes you wonder if that might be a factor. At the same time, you have to recognize that other things you can't measure could also be the reason. Some of the things they're not able to measure are the quality of the K-12 schooling, that was brought up earlier, and also whether there are differences in labor market networking or mentorship that perhaps are the causes. Some of the implications from this kind of work seem to be that, given that education narrows but does not eliminate the gap, I forgot, I got a little more here before I go to the implications. It does, college education is more successful in eliminating the gap in employment rates, like the percentage of people who are employed. That gap does reduce more between high school and college for American Indians than it does for whites. In earnings, it does not, but for the tendency to be employed, American Indians actually get, if anything, a slightly higher bump from going to college. And if you count even a broader measure, which is either being employed or looking for work, being in the labor force, college education is on par with, completely eliminates the gap there for American Indians versus whites. Here are the implications, which I was rushing to get to. Given that the earnings for American Indian and Alaska Native college graduates are not as high above high school grads as they are for whites, it suggests they may have a harder time paying off college debt. All other things equal, might favor more use of grants over loans for American Indian and Alaska Native students, or programs that and build in some degree of loan forgiveness. One possibility, Dr. Brayboy is here, he has suggested loan forgiveness programs for jobs in which the worker is directly giving back to the community. That might make sense given these findings as well. Moving on to Alessia Liebert's work, which is very interesting. She's actually able to integrate data in Minnesota on what people did in college, what their degree was, what their major was, and what their experience after college is in the labor force. So she's linking good college data from Minnesota Office of Higher Education to data on actual earnings reported in the for anyone who stays in Minnesota and does not get employed by a federal government or is not working on their own. If they're an employee of a non-federal employer in Minnesota, she's able to track them after college. And what she's finding here is that American Indians tend to do the least well. If they end up after college in part-time, their part-time earnings are low relative to other groups. If they end up in a full-time year-round job, which is ideal, again, their annual earnings are low relative to other racial or ethnic groups. They are also more likely than most to be in a part-time jobs rather than full-time, therefore less likely to be in a full-time year-round job. So we're seeing less, as we track the students out of college into the labor force, we're seeing less success. We're seeing success, but less success. Again, we are also missing, by the way, students who move to a different state. If they came here for Minnesota for education, went to North Dakota to work, we don't see that. There's other things we're not seeing. We're seeing about half of the graduates from Minnesota schools here in these various categories. And furthermore, there's another important finding, I think, is that the ones who do the best are those who are finishing their degrees before 30. So we've talked a lot here about how American Indian, Alaska Native students are non-traditional. We find a lot of them in this category here of finishing age 31 to 35 rather than finishing age 20 to 30. And that does matter. Here we have finishing below a bachelor's, finishing above a bachelor's. We have the same repeated down here for the two different age groups. The closest to parity you're going to get is bachelor's and above finished before 30, where the American Indian are making 94% of the whites. Still not what we want. It's a gap, but it's better than the 83, the 82, and the 70% that you're seeing in these other groups, whether you're completing at a later age or not, or completing a degree less than a bachelor's. So it really, there is an apparent premium in the Minnesota job market for American Indians who can finish at a relatively early age and finish a bachelor's degree. And that, I think, is an important finding that corroborates some of the discussion we've had today about the non-traditional nature of much of the American Indian college population. So again, implications, looking at all three studies, college completion does matter. Boosting the four-year college degree attainment does have potential to narrow the gaps in jobs, in occupations, high skill occupations, and in wages. Apparently, we're judging by correlations. It's not fully rock-solid causality, but the correlations at least suggest that degrees are more likely to be effective if they're completed before 30, and that so far, at least, the gains to a college degree are high, but less than for non-Hispanic whites. Talked about why we have to be cautious in interpreting the causality here. So we would like to do more research, at the same time begin considering policies that would increase degree completion, especially at more traditional ages, that would potentially reduce debt loads, and would address somehow the job finding issues of the older American Indian Alaska Native graduates. So I kind of went through that fast, but we're near the end of the day. I think I'm going to leave it there and maybe take a few minutes of questions before Randy comes up for the discussion, where we'll go back to covering anything that we've covered all day today and really get into how we can work together to do things that we need to do.
Hi. I have a question on the chart, one page back. The thing that jumps out to me is that huge jump in the salary for bachelors and above for white individuals from 31 to 55. Do you have anything, are you aware of anything that?
One thing that I'm guessing, I don't know the details of Alessia's study, but some of this may be, again, it's bachelors and above. Some of this may be people going back after having got a BA, going back for a master's, let's say, or an MBA or that kind of thing, where they've got a job, they've had a job for a while, their employer asks them to get an MBA and they get a promotion out of that. That may be more prevalent here.
So that, yeah, again, relative to American Indian Alaska.
That's a guess, not a fact.
That might.
I just wondered if you took a look at geographic differences. So if folks restrict themselves to, let's say, the job market in one particular geographic area versus folks that are willing to move about more freely, among more distant areas, that might explain some of the differences.
In Alessia's results from Minnesota, you mean? Yeah, I mean, it is a defect of her results that she cannot track people who leave the states. She's working at a state government. The state government is allowing her to link very confidentially these higher education records to these employment records. It's very confidential. She works in a closed environment. You can't get at this data easily. So that's why, because she's at a state government using state confidential data, she can do Minnesota but not other states. So it is a flaw. There's a possibility that those who leave the state have different experience.
Sure, but you might see the effect within the state. That's kind of my point, if you would choose to look.
I missed. I thought you meant people who moved elsewhere. Sorry.
No, just moving around. If you're willing to leave your hometown.
Oh, hometown.
Right.
I don't. She's beginning to get new data sets to Lincoln that might help with that. I mean, I don't think the college data itself gives you a hometown, but she is starting to link into some other state records that might allow her to do that. In our work on the occupational findings, by the way, in that paper, we did do some regional work in the U.S., looking at how these things break out a bit regionally in the U.S.
I had a similar question. I wondered about students who graduated, and some got jobs, some did not, and is there a difference in students' willingness to move or to look for jobs in large urban areas versus going back home and looking for a job there? So.
Well, yeah, I don't.
Not that data, but the finding a job.
Okay, the finding a job. This one. Yeah. Well, actually, we'll have to ask Alessia that tomorrow. I don't think she talked about it in the article itself. Whether she looked at that behind the scenes, I don't know. I do know that in the results here, Christine did control for proximity to an American Indian homeland, and also for ruralness of the.
Okay.
She's using the
All right,
IPMS
that makes
data
sense. Yep.
where you look at pumas, which are fairly large areas, in rural areas at least.
Okay.
But you did find, Christine, you remind me, you did found some effect from, if you can, on the rural, do you remember what you found on rural and pumas? I think you did find they were significant, and that they, my recollection is that you found that they did somewhat reduce the return.
Yeah, I think the story, so like you have in the slide here, the disparity story stood out more in urban areas. And I think this is what you're alluding to, the idea
That's
that sort of very high paying jobs, you oftentimes have to move to urban centers. And so if there's a differential preference around moving towards urban centers, that's important. Off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly what the story, but I do know that there was less of a gap in the rural areas. And then it was noisy around the homeland data just because the sample size gets really small. So I have less confidence with that conclusion.
Yeah, so I guess if I summarize it, the gap between the returns for American Indians and whites is bigger in the urban areas. The gap is smaller in rural areas because both get lower returns there. And okay, and I'll probably be the last one unless there's a huge demand. I think this will be the last one, and we'll bring Randy up for our discussion.
It actually piggybacks off of the last question on that particular slide, where it says it doesn't confirm, but the results are consistent with. And I'm just curious, because the other two factors were the quality of K through 12 schooling and or labor market networking mentorship. K through 12 schooling is based on funds from the state or the government, which are out of the control of the communities. There is disparity between minority students and students of Euro descent. That is a fact. So it seems like it's more than consistent with, it seems like it supports institutional racism, which it means the disparities continue for generations because of things like funding at the state and federal levels.
Yeah, I think that if the explanation for the gaps were K through 12 schooling, yeah, then you would have to say, why do we have these K through 12 problems? Yeah.
The language is sort of for publication in econ journals where you have to like couch your language to say like we have not proven and we just, you know, there's always more research to be done. And because of the particular statistical methodology that we use, we don't have the kind of causality that they would like. However, if you ask me sort of what my read of the data is, it is largely consistent, in fact, confirms any story you want to tell me about institutionalized racism all throughout the K higher ed system into the labor market as well. And so the conversation then becomes, this paper won't tell us anything necessarily about where we'll get the most bang for our buck in terms of attacking that problem, but I think it would be fodder for anybody who has ideas about where to attack to say this is why we need to do it, because we're seeing on the labor market outcome, we're seeing these disparities continue not to narrow, but in fact to widen until we address some of those concerns. So I think your interpretation is right.
So I think we'll bring Randy up. If there are more questions, we've got a full hour here to go. And
I don't know if folks realize that as Christine was speaking, I saw a lot of head nodding. So I think this is a really very ripe question and issue for further conversation.
so David and Catherine, if you're still here, I think Catherine might have to go to the airport at some point, but if you can come up, join me. We're not meant, and Chris, we're not meant to be the ones who answer these questions, but because we gave presentations, we'll try to be up here and be available.
I just turned this off. Okay.
Yeah. I can share this one. Randy might have to get your mic up high.
Dick, is it possible for one more comment?
You can do one while we're transitioning.
I just wanted to say that those are the kinds of questions that you get at conferences. And so if there's a way of talking about that in the paper that we control for in this, otherwise people sit there and are skeptical. And so the more that we can show the concentration, the places where the concentration of jobs is compared with the places that are more rural, and show both of those sets of data. It helps. So, thanks.
Can you guys hear me? Hi, everybody. So, aloha. I'm Randy Aki. I'm an assistant professor at UCLA in public policy and American Indian Studies. I'm Native Hawaiian. Sorry. And I am here to help sort of engage the audience. Sort of a number of you have already raised very interesting questions, but our intent for this section, this section is to get sort of feedback from you on some concrete, some further steps that we as a group, individuals, organizations, researchers, etc., may be able to sort of cross these divides and figure out ways in which to push us forward and come to some potential problem solving amongst the issues that we categorize or prioritize as the most important. And so a lot of things came out of the presentation. There were 4 presentations that happened here. I have some notes and I'm happy to start us off, but it also feels like there's a lot of really interesting ideas, so I could give a shot, but I'd prefer not to sort of jump in first. So if there were other concerns and questions from any of the speakers that we had earlier, please raise your hand and let's get started, because there are multiple topics. So let me just summarize again. So Christine gave us the overview of kind of the snapshot of where we are. Broadly speaking, with regard to American Indian, higher education, AIAN, higher education, right? Tertiary education, post-secondary. She gave us a bunch of these characteristics of the population and detailed some of the interesting data sets. Dave gave us the input on AICF and what they're doing and the kind of relationships they have. We also had the impact from AHEC, from Catherine, telling us where their work is being focused, who they work with, the population that they serve, that they're looking to get better assessments of. And then Dick told us a little bit about some of the impact of the sparse and very grateful for the existing work that does exist that tells us where the sort of labor market returns are for higher education for this population, which is an understudied population in general, but in particular with regard to sort of the economic outcomes and the social benefits that result from things like higher education. So those are sort of the broad topics. Again, I think there's a lot there, and I think we raised a lot of these questions already. I think one of the first ones that came up was this idea of definition that I heard at the very beginning. And so definition in the sense of who's American Indian, who's Alaska Native. And so shall we start there? That was sort of one of the issues that Christine had with regard to, there were multiple questions regarding this. Oh, there is someone who wants to. Oh, sorry, I thought you, oh, no, okay. Who raised the, yeah.
There's an old rule in our family, you don't stick a microphone near us.
Yeah, okay.
But it does bring an interesting question, because that's a place that we really struggle with the data collection, is we always seem to get 2 subsets of data. We seem to get here's the students who identified as American Indian or enrolled by the federal definition, and here's the students who self-identify or they claim more than one, and that seems to really mess with the data sets. But one thing I just want to point out really quickly too on this is that even though that's confusing in itself, if we take a look at this on the first page of the planner, it says Tribal Community Perspectives on Higher Education. And I think a lot of this comes into the framework. And then right below it, we flip the definition into strategies for tribal communities to gain benefits of college. Really, it benefits all of our college campuses to have more diversity. It benefits our communities. I almost think that should be switched around. And I think that's where we come into some of the problems with some of our identification in that process.
Would you mind just another second, sort of helping define for some people who don't have the exposure to the differences in the categorization of American Indian, Alaska Native, what I could tell you what I think they are, but I'd like to hear from someone
Yeah,
else.
I guess from my perspective of what I see at the university that I work at Bemidji State University, we get a subset of data that has a student who has identified as American Indian, only one ethnic background.
Yep.
Then you also get a second subset of data that is students who identified 2 or more
Absolutely.
ethnicities, one of which is American Indian.
And then the third category, which transcends self-identification, is tribal enrollment, right? And that's something that, so it's something that doesn't exist for the time being on OMB data collection for the census and for other data sets. But that clearly is something that communities have said that they're interested in, which is, again, a differential marker, right? One can be a tribal citizen and be single race or multiple races. So you see that there are these 3 potential categories that we can, bins that we can put our collective group in, and they may or may not affect the ultimate variables or the averages that we are showing, right? And that's one of the first things I heard people talking about, definitions of who we're counting, how we're counting them, and what their results look like. Because they may give us very different types of results, right? And one can imagine the various ways in which they expand the population or shrink the population depending on how the definition is used in any context. Yes, another point.
I just got an email from my son. He's I'm a first-generation college graduate. My grandfather was not an American citizen when he was born. My mother and dad were pretty much run out of public school. I graduated high school and went to college, and now my children are in college and they're doing pretty well. When I was in college, it was a benefit to be enrolled in the tribe, because we didn't really have much of a financial burden that we could get financial aid. I just got a email from the education office saying that my son now has a high family contribution and a high student contribution, which is like $6,000. And his mother has a college degree, but she is doing independent business, trying to get a business going. So we really don't have no money.
No. So
it's like, we're going backwards here. We're trying to get economically stable, but we have to carry that burden for our kids. And when we look at there was $1,600 sent back to the tribe because the college said that he is over income.
So that sounds like a theme that others have talked about as well, sort of the financial burden of higher education, of post-secondary. Are there others that have similar insight and want to share? There's a hand in the background, and tell us a little bit about what you think we should think about.
My name is Terry Scott. I'm the director of the Meskwaki Higher Education Program. And our program funds students to go to school. Tribally enrolled students receive up to $9,000 a semester, and descendants can receive up to $4,500 a semester. What we're seeing right now is that students are, we go by the FAFSA, it's all worked out very carefully. We work a page called the Financial Aid Verification Form, ensuring that whatever the Financial Aid Office tells us is the cost of attendance, we follow that to the strict law in order so that we do not have a problem with going over the cost of attendance. I have had conversations with schools to talk about the issue of student contribution, parent contribution, because within the range of possibilities for funding, loans are also included in that package. However, loans are a parent contribution. So it happens sometimes that financial aid officers end up counting that twice, and they don't need to be doing that. And until a conversation actually happens with the financial aid office, that's gonna need to, that'll probably stay that way. The other issue that we're finding right now is that, of course, financial aid officers across the country were concerned about the problem of the bottlenecking that happens at the beginning of the year. And so they determined that it would be better if, and the biggest issue was that people didn't quite have their taxes done. And so what they did was they said, okay, let's have everybody for the 2017 years use the 2015 taxes. When that happened, it caused more paperwork because now people have to verify everything. So that's a big issue all the way across. We're starting to see it too. Our biggest issue, though, is that we have a lot of students who are receiving per cap. The per capita funding is creating an issue because they have to report that on their taxes for the tribes who are saying that they have to do that, or the states who have some kind of agreement to ensure that that does happen. But what that's causing is that if it was in 2014 that a student received a $72,000 check from their tribe, that they have to report that, and so it's impacting our 2015. And so what it means is they can't receive any funding from Pell, and we cannot fund them either. So they're stuck. And that creates a problem because then what it comes down to is financial education, financial literacy education, because they're not realizing that, you know, they can receive this money, but then you need to use it for something. So it's not always about us educated people teaching or you know, solving problems. It's teaching them ahead of time to be responsible. And we cannot go on forever allowing them not to take responsibility for themselves with this kind of money that's coming in. But the other thing too is that what I keep hearing about is, you know, and I get parents calling me all the time too saying, how come my kid doesn't get the $9,000 that you promised? It's like, no, it's not what it's about. It's about numbers. And I have to teach them and explain it to them that this is how it works out, because that cost of attendance is a ceiling amount and they cannot receive any more than that. And we have indeed had schools send money back to us because they were over. The other thing that's happening too is that schools are offering grants to Native American students. The sad part about our money that goes to those schools, this has happened to us more than once. This also happens to be the case for NCAA rules, that if a student receives a grant from the NCAA to play at an NCAA school and they get other money, that other money takes the place of that to a percentage. So money that is intended to come back to the student to help them with housing and food and all of that, they don't receive it because the school takes it.
So,
and they put their own money back in their coffers and take the travel money instead.
So it sounds like you're identifying a slightly different issue, which is helpful from, I think, what I think we heard earlier was that there are just huge financial need for certain populations. What you're identifying, I think I'm understanding, is that there are financial resources in some circumstances, and the schools themselves are sort of at an impasse on how to deal with them in certain circumstances, or the blip in which the lump sum is paid, for instance, when someone turns 18 or what have you. That in and of itself can be an obstacle to financial aid or financial accessibility, it sounds like.
Yeah, and that bigger piece to us right now is what we're seeing is that, again, tribal dollars are going in to take care of a student's bill. When the school said before that they're giving them grants, then they take the grants back. And then they say, well, there's no money for you now. You can't get any refund on any of this money because it's been replaced. And that's very unfortunate, and it's very, very upsetting to us.
And I want to, this sounds pretty important. I don't know, this one's not working.
It was on.
There it is. So it sounds like an important thread to pick up on here. I'm wondering if we can also bring it back into the data realm a little bit more explicitly.
Yeah.
Okay, you know, Chris, you talked about the post-secondary aid survey, whatever it was called. You know, I suspect it doesn't get anywhere near covering that level of complexity, and yet these sound like pretty serious problems. What do we, do you see a way, do people see a way in the audience or up here that we can get better tracking of these kinds of problems, you know, that would allow for them to be surfaced, be addressed, for education to occur? What do we need to be finding out about, the kind of aid situation in general? Where can we make improvements with the data to learn more about the aid problems? Anyone have ideas?
My name's Jennifer Simon. I work at Augsburg University, which is a small private institution here in Minneapolis. I specifically work with American Indian Students Services and financial aid, so coming from that perspective. I think there's a huge lack of education in our financial aid departments, in particularly with non-TCUs, and I don't know my experience of that. I've worked at 3 different institutions who are all both public. This is the first private institution, and there's a huge lack of just awareness about, in particularly, tribal funding and outside scholarships specifically for Native students. Because like what she had said, that happens often when grants are given to students thinking that they have a high need without knowing external resources coming in, and then they reduce aid that they thought they needed, but then learned that they didn't. And so then, of course, that frustrates everybody. And particularly the students and the family. So I think that is an area that really needs to be addressed in public and private institutions, and particularly is the awareness of our financial aid departments and even VPs of enrollment, at that level. About data collection, kind of going back just 2 points. I think there needs to be maybe, I don't know if there can be a universal data reporting at institutions, but I know the 3 institutions that I went through, I went back and forth personally. I grew up on my reservation in South Dakota. And so I came from that perspective when I first went to school, and thinking that, all Native students who identify should be tribally enrolled like I was, and that perspective. And then I later learned, as I learned genocide and more of what happened to our people, that a lot of people learn their identity while they're in college. And so with private colleges, I've changed my application as related to who identifies as American Indian multiple times. And so it's complex, because then you get the American Indian and you get the American Indian and Black, or you get the American Indian and white, or dual races, or triracial, or whatever it is. And then it just complexes everybody when they're looking at data at an institution. So I guess that's, for me, a question of what has worked for other people. What I'm doing now, I think, works the best of what I've all tried, but still it's not perfect.
Does someone else have a take on that? Where the focus from experience organizationally, experientially has been, and why it's been that way? There's a couple people back here.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. So what I want to go back to the aid displacement problem.
Yep.
It's not unique to just tribal communities. It's a problem for any outside source scholarship program. And an immediate solution that the scholarship program I worked for, students who were facing this barrier, they gave them the option of loan repayment. So in order to avoid their institutional grants getting displaced, they would pay back the students' loans so that they wouldn't accrue interest. In regards to the data around this, so Nces, I know, captures institutional grants, but this is probably a question for Dr. Stoddard. I doubt that they capture a shift when a Promise program grant comes in, or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
It's just like a static data point, and then.
Yeah, it's it's just a snapshot at a certain point in time, and it's certainly not disaggregated down to the level where you can tell anything beyond institutional, or it's not state, not federal, not institutional, but something else. So it could be a Rotary Club scholarship, or it could be aid from a tribe, and it's not distinguished at that level. So, I would just echo the concern that transparency, I think, for students and greater financial education are really important solutions. I think there's a growing awareness of that across our institutions, that students get a lot of help at the end when they graduate. Here's how to repay your student loans, but not a lot of help at the beginning figuring out how to navigate the whole system.
Sure.
Okay, just as an example of what we've done at our university, and it still needs
to be changed, I think. This Washington State University. So in about the year 2000, somewhere in there, up till that time, the state required all 2- and 4-year public, 4-year public institutions to have exactly the same application. And then in about 2000, we could develop our own. At that time, I worked with the Attorney General at our university, and we made a change. We inserted a question right next to citizenship. So you had, are you a citizen of the United States? And for that question, that's a required question that everyone has to fill out. So immediately following it, we inserted, are you an enrolled member of an American Indian tribe or Alaskan Native village or corporation? If they answered yes, then there was a line for writing in their tribe. If they answered no, then there was, are you a descendant? Because in working with our Native American Advisory Board to our president, it was clear that it's also important to track descendants. Now, the question still remained in the optional category of what do you consider your ethnicity? So there were 2 places where a Native person could mark. Neither one of them were required. And our university attorneys were like, well, we can't require a person to say whether or not they are an enrolled tribal member. I think that's an area for discussion, because if we are a citizen or if we're a descendant, we're part of this nation, so. But under back when they added the 2 or more races, they also, now Hispanic is the default. So the very first question is, are you Hispanic or Hispanic surname? We know we have enrolled, we have Native students who marked Hispanic. After that, it doesn't matter what you mark. You're going to be counted as Hispanic. So you might mark 2 or more races, but you're still going to be counted as Hispanic.
That's an ethnicity. It's not a race on the census category. Hispanic, you can be Hispanic and of the black race, white race, American,
but
indigenous race.
You're not counted. You're only counted as Hispanic.
In the state
That's
or
how it's being
nationally?
reported nationally. That's how it's reported.
It's not.
That's my understanding.
No,
That's what I've been told at our university.
I don't think that's true.
The only ones reported as Native to IPEDS is those who only checked Native American. So I guess my main point is I do think nationally there needs to be an agreed upon definition of how this data is collected, and it also affects K through 12. The research done there in Washington State, it's just all over the board, depending on different title programs, how the information's collected. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Someone wanted to comment on that?
I don't know if I need a mic for live stream purposes. Bujo Dennis Olson, enrolled member of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa here in Minnesota. Did I get a fist bump
from Karen,
former chairwoman diver? I'm the executive director of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, but have spent majority of my career in K-12 Indian education program administration. And I just wanted to comment on that because, it seems like that's become a point of confusion now, even with K-12 data, is the Hispanic Latino disaggregation, because the new federal definition, or actually it's not new, the original federal definition of American Indian student includes a community or cultural connection to indigenous communities in North, Central, and South America, right? And so if you're an American Indian student checking that box, you're a Hispanic Latino student potentially also checking that box, is that an unintentional indigenous catch-all? And I know, there's major state K-12 funding formulas, and I'm sure it's the same with financial aid and in higher ed, based on that. And you start kind of getting to a more granular level of who is American Indian, who isn't, you're talking millions or potentially even billions with a B dollars in funding shifts based on that definition, that federal definition, which a lot of people have deemed problematic. And just one final thing, I remember probably, it had to be about 10 years ago now, Dr. Dawn McAtee, when she was with the National Indian Education Association,
put out a short paper, an article called Who Counts as Native? And she looked at that when the feds kind of readopted a new definition of American Indian. It shifted everything wildly. I mean, by like 50%.
Absolutely.
And so, I'm kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop. And, I'm interested to look at the Education Northwest, kind of the REL data in that study, as well as kind of interested to hear more from Dr. Brayboy. But, I mean, yeah, there's got to be a solve here. And I don't know what the solve is. And, even as our nations go through nation building and constitutional reform and other, we're even looking at amending how we define ourselves and define who is and isn't a member. So
it sounds to me like, just to summarize what you said, it sounded like you guys in Washington State have adopted a more flexible and you've allowed more categories for individuals to self-identify in various ways, whether enrolled citizens, amongst different race and ethnic groups. And I think what you were contrasting it with was the national definition. And I think that's something we want to, sort of save, right? This idea of sort of the flexibility that can be done at the ground level or at particular community levels, that is going to be clearly much harder at the national level for various reasons, or not, I don't know. But that's sort of what I think I hear you saying, and I just want to sort of make sure I'm correct in that that's one of the takeaways from what you're talking about.
What it has done at our institution is it does provide us more information with who our students are. But as a university, that's not how they report the numbers. They report based on
the national.
The national.
Sure.
And in fact, even just getting our university to pull out this information has been a challenge.
But it does seem like that maybe is some sort of a best practice or something that might want to be discussed further, that one could have these definitions that are custom made state by state or region by region, but that align with the national reporting that ultimately has to be done at some point so that there's an alignment. But nevertheless, it can be disaggregated in some way that's user-friendly at this community level or this community level, because it does sound like, and from some of my experience, that terminology differs, right? In Alaska, the definition of membership is different than it is in Oklahoma or another tribal community, or in Hawaii as well, right? And so those custom-built definitions that are relevant to the community might be more appropriate there. And so I think that is a sort of a takeaway that I think maybe is something we want to kind of revisit. There's another comment there, and I'll stop talking.
Hi, Laura John with Education Northwest. So we worked with Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana on this report that I think Major's going to get copies for everyone, and it does give some sort of on-the-ground ideas for getting better data. So things like adding a citizenship question. When the definition was changed by the Department of Education and their guidance that they sent out, there was no tribal consultation in changing that definition to expand it to Central and South American Indian. There's no tribal consultation. Number two, what I wanted to say is asking citizenship is, are you a citizen of a tribal nation, is respecting the tribe's sovereignty and ability to define their members. And I think that that's very important. And that isn't in this conversation or conversations about how American Indians are defined. Lastly, I wanted to say that the change in data is shocking. I worked with Barb over at WSU. We did a case study to go along with this report, and I had conversations with their data folks over there. And they showed me their data. So there's a phenomenon that happens, and this is, apparently this is something that happens quite a bit in higher education, where students that are applying select that they're American Indian, but at no time in the future do they ever select that they're American Indian again. Which, if you think about, one of the number one stereotypes of American Indian students is that we get free money for school, right? So it may be that that's an issue, and the implications of that are far-reaching. I was the graduate assistant at WSU at the Native Student Center, and was coordinating our retention program. Our particular program, we kept getting talked to because we didn't have enough outreach hours. Maybe 20% of the students that were on that list that had identified as Native American were even interested in the service, because those others, they weren't tied to a community. This wasn't their culture base. They didn't have the same challenges. And so it made our center look like we weren't doing the work. So there's so much involved in this. And I do, the solution is the federal definition needs to change. If you look in that document from Department of Ed, when they made this change, there is one sentence in that document, and it says, if states see that it's important to report further data besides what's just required for race ethnicity, they can do so. I haven't been able to find anything anywhere that says how that is done, but I think that could potentially be another solution, is to get what needs to happen in order for the state of Washington to report that we want to report American Indians who are Washington tribes, or whatever it may be. Right. I think this is especially important now with ESSA and the requirement of tribal consultation. Tribal consultation is required when there's a certain percentage of Native students that are in that school, right, or the amount of Title VI funding. So it's huge. It's huge.
Thank you. There was a comment here as well.
Thank you. Also, I wanted to just
Sure.
quickly, if you can hear me, is that the report that Laura's talking about, we'll have that printed and disperse it tomorrow morning when we're here.
It's a very layered and complex issue. I'm from, I don't think it's working. It's on.
Now it's on.
Just speak into it.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a very complex and layered issue. I'm from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the reason I'm here is to listen and to learn, because we want to rewrite our guidelines to improve and increase the number of applicants from TCUs as well as HBCUs. And the major challenge I represent the Division of Education, and the major challenge for us is that HSIs are also included in this category, which are Hispanic serving institutions. So when I'm listening to you speak about the new categorization and how that can default to Hispanic, that also can impact that institution claiming they're a Hispanic serving institution. Those institutions, as you know, are very well funded. Meaning TCUs and HBCUs, aren't as competitive against them because they have a grant writing staff, just a larger infrastructure. And so I'm very pleased and happy to be able to hear the issues. And I think one of the challenges for us is how should we language, our guidelines. And when you talk about self-identification, what terms are most helpful? What terms, speak to your needs and would serve these institutions, these universities the best? And just to go back a little bit further, when you talked about sort of how do you collect data, one, collaboration I think is really important. There have been sort of population census in different states. So one of the Humanities Councils did a population census to show just what you were saying, the economic value, the cultural value. And so there is a possibility to do such a census with TCUs or with Native in any institution of higher education. The other is a lot of the issues that are discussed here fall right into diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, which, as you know, is a really big, it's a big thread for a lot of nonprofit funders, as well as the Kellogg Institute, which puts a lot of money behind that. So I would encourage the AIAN and any other populations to get involved, more integrated in that, because it's a fight for all of the sort of underserved populations to receive better services, receive parity?
Thank you for that. So there's another comment back here, but before, I just want to, again, summarize what I think I'm hearing from people saying, is that, again, these definitions of who qualifies or who identifies or who is seen as AIAN matters for performance at universities, because it tells us how well we're doing our jobs of serving the population. It matters for foundations because it allows them to identify whether or not this institution is serving that underserved population. So definitions matter, how we define ourselves, and there are some solutions potentially of doing it more flexibly at different community, state, regional levels that allow for the inclusion of certain variables and certain questions that may or may not be as acceptable at the more aggregate level.
And I'm going to, I guess, use a little prerogative to jump in. We're sticking my neck out a little bit because this is a conversation that I'm not personally going to take a stand in, except for this, that one of the reasons we have the conference is to see if people want to work together afterward. And so I will try to leave a place, maybe at the reception, maybe somewhere else. I'll try to leave a place for people who want to work on this identity issue to, go ahead and identify as people who want to work on the identity issue. And we will try to put you in touch with each other if that's helpful. In the same vein, we heard to less discussion, but for the same reason I want to bring up the comment that was made by, I think, the woman from Augsburg. What's your name? Jennifer from Augsburg, that we need more education of people in the financial aid office. That was a Minnesota college making that comment. We have people like here from Coeur d'Alene who've done a lot of work between the tribe and the college. Maybe they've got answers for that. I would be open also. I'll make a parking lot, and maybe it'll just be me and maybe Jen, I don't know. But I'd be open to anyone else who wants to also self-identify as willing to work, willing to have a dialogue, follow-up dialogue on that issue of whether there's ways we can work with the financial aid offices and such. So I will try to do things like that as I hear themes come here, that we can try to have people step forward and agree to work on things.
So
perfect. Thank you for bringing that back to the question about financial aid. I wanted to make a brief comment on that problem. I completely agree with it, and I think there's some bright spots out there. So to the call for partnership there, one of the things we saw is with an organization called the Wallen Education Partners, and they're a scholarship providing organization. But one of the aspects that they did really effectively is that they are a negotiator with the financial aid office for students. And what the students qualify for, they keep 100% of that. I don't know how they do it. They told us it's very staff intensive, but they've been very effective in negotiating that with the students. And so, for the researchers in the room here, as you think about how you address that challenge, I think that makes a wonderful case study. I'm sure there's others around, but that's the one that came to mind. And I think we can all learn from how they do it and what it takes to really actually reform and work with financial aid offices. I mean, we can talk to them all day long, but I think if we can't show them how to do it or what to do and what the incentive is for them, I think it's going to be a lot of conversations that yield really little. So just
Thank
a thought.
you. So we've touched on two topics already. I want to give the opportunity for us to move on to other topics. We talked about financial aid and sort of the impact there and its role in success or continuing on to post-secondary education, as well as this, again, self-identification or classification of AIAN students and children, or ultimately young adults. Are there other topics that were raised from our speakers, our discussants earlier, that we'd like to touch on that others feel that we haven't given a good shot at yet? I'm happy to move on towards that. In the back, please.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm a librarian, so I have to have a microphone and I have to make sure it's working. My name is Hannah. I'm from Leech Lake Tribal College. I'm also a member of Governor Dayton's Task Force on Broadband in Minnesota, so I have a broadband-related question. And this ties in with financial aid, too. So the FAFSA application, that is an online application. We heard today about degree attainment being low or lower among American Indian and Alaska Native students. We heard about that FAFSA and financial aid being not completed as often among those students. And then we also saw some data about those students possibly traveling far from home and losing those home connections, which can be in part maintained through internet access and access to technology. At Leech Lake Tribal College, we do some surveys with our students in the library to see what they have access to in terms of computers and internet. 49% of our incoming freshmen in 2016 had a computer at home that worked, and I think it was about 2/3 had internet access at home. If you look at broadband data from the FCC out of, I think it was 2016, it's about 1/3 of people living in rural tribal areas have access to broadband. So with this really pretty critical connection between access to technology and educational attainment, I was wondering if anyone in the room or any of the panelists would be able to address whether you are aware of any data that kind of bridges these areas and looks at American Indian and Alaska Native students' success as it pertains to technology access, correct? As well as just some broader address of that issue, because I think it is one that matters. I don't know if I just derailed everything, but thank you for letting me do that.
No, it's a question about data, and maybe there's someone in the room that has expertise on this and knows characteristics of the online native world, or no? Please, no.
No, not a comment, but I do have another topic after she's done. I can make a short comment, which is I don't know the specific answers, but I do know there is an economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture who is working on assembling good data on broadband in Indian country. And I'd be happy to work with you, Hannah, to maybe talk to him and see if we can maybe work with Chris and his name is Peter Stenberg. Maybe Chris and Peter Stenberg can link these.
FCC has some data as well.
Yes, they do. Yes. So we can try to follow up on that.
You know, I can say related to that point, I know there's an older survey, and this is just like off the top of my head here, but looking at AP course taking, because in many rural areas, there isn't, or small schools, there's not a big enough population of high school students to have a standalone AP chemistry class or whatever. And so this issue of broadband access and college prep courses becomes really salient. But again, I know that's an older survey, but another aspect to just, kind of think about.
That's great, thank you. There was another comment over here, a different comment, I think.
Yes, if everyone's done with that topic, I have another one.
Please.
Okay. Awesome, Hannah. My name is Tracy Hendrickson. I am with the Leech Lake Tribal College, and my question relates back to the data and discussing the for-profit colleges and the certificates. And I agree, they are very attractive for underrepresented students. My concern, and I'm wondering if there is any data, because I know at our institution and others I've been at, one of the problems you have is surveying students post-graduation or even after stop-out. Has there been any studies, or are there any studies going on that focus on the workforce? What was going on in the workforce that allowed these for-profit institutions to pull in for certain certificates? For example, I don't know, some industry needed a skill. What happened to those students when they completed the certificate? Were they able to get jobs? What happened when that skill was not needed? Were they laid off, back to square one? I would just like to see some data on that.
Yeah, that's a big question. It's a new literature, I can say that, and none of it that I am aware of is specific to Native students. So just looking at for-profits in general, I can tell you a couple of things that I think the literature has established. One is that funding, public funding for community colleges and state universities does seem to have led to some of the erosion of that funding seems to have led to some of the growth in for-profit institutions. So there's my pitch for more public funding.
And there's research on community colleges being much more sort of a better return.
Yes, although it's new. I mean, the research on return. So I would say the literature is mixed at the moment. I think there are a number of studies that find for-profits have kind of no better returns than community colleges. That said, some of my own work has shown that for-profit colleges tend to be faster in responding to labor market changes in the industry. And so thinking about what we can do to help community colleges or other public institutions to change their degree offerings faster, I think is something that's important to think about. As far as really good follow-on studies, I would say, no. So, yeah, I think that's an important question, though.
And I'm thinking maybe closing those gaps between industry and the college would help speed that up, whereas those for-profit institutions, they have the extra resources the smaller TCUs lack. So I don't know if anybody comes up with any strategies for closing that gap with industry, especially in the rural settings. Let me know. Any of my team, we would appreciate it.
I will just add quickly that let's maybe ask Alessia Liebert if she is here tomorrow, the one who's got the data in Minnesota on what happens in the labor market after college, if she is able to identify certificates in her college day. I don't know if she can or she cannot, but let's ask tomorrow.
And the unemployment changes, right, which she's asking. Other questions? Yes.
I don't know if this is a question or a series of comments. One, I just want to put out I actually want to make two comments, or maybe a question in these, and forgive me, colleagues. One is, I think that in the study that, in the PowerPoint that Dick pointed out, there was a bullet in there. It was a third or fourth bullet point of one of those that sort of talked about what happens with boys or with men who graduate. And I think that I want to put this on the table. I think we don't know a whole bunch about Native boys and men, except to know that since 1972, Native boys and men have gone from being about 67% of college natives in college to now about somewhere between 38 and 40%, depending on what you're looking at. Those data are somewhat alarming that Christine's paper have, if that's the case, about sort of there not being a lot of maybe reason to go to college. I suspect there's a whole bunch of stuff caught up in that sociologists and econometricians and others can sort of think about a larger framing of that. We haven't spent nearly enough time sort of focused on that. But the other thing is I think that this notion of return on investment for engaging in higher ed is such a huge topic and something that I think we want to continue to come back to. We have some sense, the general population, what happens over a period of lifetime for people who, from the ages of 21 to 64, who have no high school diploma, some college, graduate degree, professional degree, what happens to them over a period of a lifetime in terms of what they earn. It doesn't appear that we can actually do that for Native folks, to sort of think about, there's just captured in all of this, it seems to me, and even this last comment about the certificates is really, and maybe Sherry Solway-Black's going to address this tomorrow, is really about sort of larger questions around economic development and how that gets created in communities so that people don't have to leave their tribal areas and they can engage in some of this work. So I just think there's a larger kind of conversation that we're nibbling around the edges here that I would love to have a parking lot to sort of talk with people about.
So I want to follow up on that and also push the audience a little bit as well. We're talking about definitions of who identifies and who's characterized as AIAN, but I think in the same realm, what you're bringing up here is what constitutes success? How do we define the word success? Is it purely dollars, or is it quality of life, or is it how much you give back to your community after getting post-secondary education? The example that I always think about and I teach my students about is in my community, the most sort of culturally sort of trained individuals are kumu hula, are hula instructors. They don't get taught in a university. They don't get taught in a school. They get taught by other kumu hula. The amount of work that they spend is equivalent to a PhD, right? They spend a lifetime. On paper, they look like they have maybe a high school diploma, but they are the cultural repositories. They can be incredibly successful or they can be incredibly unsuccessful, right? They can have a giant sort of hula troupe, a school that's that in the community is looked up to them. And I know that also exists in other indigenous communities, right? There are craftspeople, there are weavers, there are artists, there are medicine people. And these ideas of some of the differences that we find that Dick showed us earlier from some of this work, the returns to education, and there are some discrepancies even when we compare within occupations, maybe due to the fact that natives, indigenous peoples, aren't necessarily maximizing their return to education. Maybe they're working 30 hours a week in some job, but that extra 10 hours a week is cultural practitioning somewhere, some way. If they worked 40 hours a week, there would be a gap. There would be a true sort of meeting of that with other groups. Or maybe it's just straight out discrimination as was offered. I don't know the answer to it. None of us know the answer to that. That's where we're at. So there are many competing potential hypotheses or answers to this. But I think, again, pushing the audience to this and the group, what defines success? What do we consider a success? And again, is that a national number that we have to report out, that the return on investment for a TCU is $3 for every dollar invested? Probably, because that's what politicians understand. But then at the individual community level, as was sort of offered here, there might be more flexibility in how we evaluate that and how we assess that, because it might not necessarily be dollar amounts or full-time employment. It might actually be quality of life, and quality of life might differ in different communities, right? The ability to go out fishing, the ability to go out harvesting things, or the ability to spend time with elders or children or grandchildren. And I think those are the sorts of things as well that fit into this question of how we collect data and who are we collecting the data for? Ourselves, the feds, the state agencies, nonprofits, foundations, and where's the differentiation and why do we do it? So I think those are sorts of things that I've heard others say, and I just wanted to add a little bit of my own on this.